In the late summer of 476 CE, a young man who bore one of the most consequential names in Roman history sat within the imperial palace at Ravenna, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of a civilization that had ruled the known world for more than a millennium. Romulus Augustus, known to his contemporaries by the diminutive Augustulus, the Little Augustus, had occupied the Western throne for approximately 10 months, having been elevated to the purple by his father Orestes, a general of barbarian origin who had served at the court of Attila the Hun before transferring his loyalties to the crumbling Roman state. The boy emperor, perhaps 14 or 15 years of age, possessed a name that united the legendary founder of Rome with the founder of the Roman Empire, yet he commanded no legions, controlled no provinces, and wielded no actual authority over the fragmentary territories that still acknowledged Western imperial sovereignty. The soldiers who had once defended the frontiers of an empire stretching from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates River now served Germanic warlords whose fathers and grandfathers had crossed the Rhine and Danube as refugees, raiders, or federates seeking land and gold within the wealthy Roman provinces. The administrative apparatus that had once collected taxes from Britain to Egypt, maintained roads across 3 continents, and sustained the largest professional army the ancient world had ever seen, had contracted to a shadow government operating from the marshes of northeastern Italy, its writ extending scarcely beyond the walls of a few fortified cities. Within weeks of that late summer, the barbarian general Odoacer would enter Ravenna at the head of his Germanic warriors, depose the child who bore the names of Rome's founders, and dispatch the imperial regalia to Constantinople, with a message declaring that the Western Empire no longer required a separate emperor, that one ruler in the East would suffice for the entire Roman world. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE has traditionally marked the end of the Western Roman Empire in the historical imagination, providing a convenient date for one of history's most consequential transformations, the transition from classical antiquity to the medieval world. Yet the men and women who lived through that September in Ravenna would not have recognised the event as the definitive conclusion of anything, for the Roman state had been fracturing, contracting, and transforming for generations, and the removal of one powerless boy emperor differed little from the dozens of depositions, assassinations, and usurpations that had characterised Roman imperial politics for centuries. The fall of Rome was not a single catastrophic moment, but rather a prolonged dissolution spanning roughly 2 centuries, during which the political, military, economic, and cultural institutions that had sustained Mediterranean civilization gradually weakened, fragmented, and ultimately collapsed under the combined pressure of external invasion, internal division, economic contraction, demographic decline, and the slow erosion of the administrative capacity that had once made Roman governance the most sophisticated system of rule the ancient world had produced. This is the story of that dissolution, from the prosperous stability of the 2nd century through the crisis of the 3rd century, the temporary recovery under Diocletian and Constantine, the catastrophic 4th century invasions, the 5th century fragmentation, and the final decades when the last vestiges of Western imperial authority flickered and died in the marshes of Ravenna. The Roman Empire that would eventually collapse had achieved its greatest territorial extent under the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century CE, when Roman authority stretched from the Scottish lowlands to the Persian Gulf, from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the Black Sea, encompassing the entire Mediterranean basin, along with vast territories to the north, south, and east. The empire at its height contained perhaps 60 million inhabitants, governed by an administrative system that combined local autonomy with imperial oversight, maintained by a professional army of approximately 400,000 soldiers stationed along frontiers stretching for thousands of miles, and connected by a road network totaling more than 50,000 miles of paved highways that facilitated the movement of troops, goods, and information across 3 continents. The cities of the Roman world, from the great metropolises of Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Carthage to the hundreds of smaller provincial centres, displayed the characteristic urban amenities that Romans considered essential to civilized existence, including forums, basilicas, theatres, amphitheatres, baths, aqueducts, and temples that testified to the wealth and sophistication of classical urban culture. The economic integration achieved under Roman rule had created a trading network of unprecedented scale, with grain from Egypt feeding the population of Rome, olive oil from Spain and North Africa illuminating the lamps of provincial households, wine from Gaul and Italy filling cups from Britain to Syria, and manufactured goods circulating throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, along trade routes that extended to India, China, and sub-Saharan Africa. The period from approximately 96 to 180 CE, encompassing the reigns of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, has been characterized by the historian Edward Gibbon as the era during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, a judgment that reflects the relative political stability, economic prosperity, and cultural achievement that mark the high point of Roman imperial civilization. The Antonine emperors governed through a combination of personal authority, bureaucratic administration, and cooperative relationships with the provincial aristocracies who served as the empire's local governing class, maintaining internal peace while defending the frontiers against the Germanic tribes to the north and the Parthian Empire to the east. The Roman army during this period remained the most formidable military force in the ancient world, its legions and auxiliary units combining disciplined infantry tactics, sophisticated engineering capabilities, and logistical systems that could sustain military operations across vast distances. The cultural confidence of the Antonine age expressed itself in the philosophical writings of Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations articulated a Stoic worldview that emphasized duty, self-discipline, and acceptance of fate, while the architectural achievements of the period, including Hadrian's rebuilding of the Pantheon in Rome and his construction of the great villa complex at Tibur, demonstrated the continuing vitality of classical artistic traditions. The legal developments of the 2nd century, including the work of the great jurists who would later be codified in Justinian's Digest, refined the Roman legal system into the sophisticated body of civil law that would influence European jurisprudence for 2 millennia. Yet even during the apparent prosperity of the Antonine period, the structural weaknesses that would eventually contribute to Roman collapse were already present, though largely invisible to contemporaries who experienced the empire at the height of its power. The Roman economy, despite its impressive integration and commercial sophistication, remained fundamentally dependent on agricultural production, using technologies that had changed little since the Bronze Age, with limited capacity for productivity improvements that might have sustained population growth or increased living standards. The empire's military requirements absorbed a substantial portion of imperial revenues, with the cost of maintaining frontier defences and the periodic expenses of major wars creating persistent fiscal pressures that encouraged emperors to debase the currency, a practice that would have devastating inflationary consequences in subsequent centuries. The demographic foundation of Roman power, the population of the Mediterranean basin that provided both soldiers and taxpayers, had already begun to experience the effects of epidemic disease, with the Antonine plague of 165 to 180 CE, probably smallpox, killing perhaps 5 million people across the empire and initiating a pattern of population decline that would accelerate in subsequent centuries. The political system of the Principate, which combined monarchical authority with republican traditions and senatorial participation, depended ultimately on the character and capabilities of individual emperors, lacking the institutional mechanisms that might have ensured stable succession or limited the damage caused by incompetent or tyrannical rulers. The reign of Marcus Aurelius, despite its philosophical distinction and military achievements, revealed the growing pressures facing the Roman state in ways that would become fully apparent only in retrospect. The Marcomannic Wars of 166 to 180 CE represented the first major incursion of Germanic peoples across the Danube frontier since the early empire, with the Marcomanni, Quadi, and other tribes penetrating into Italy itself, and requiring more than a decade of sustained military effort to repel. Marcus Aurelius spent the final years of his reign campaigning along the northern frontiers, dying at Vindobona, modern Vienna, in March of 180 CE, while planning further operations against the Germanic tribes whose pressure on the empire's boundaries would only intensify in subsequent generations. The emperor's death also marked the end of the adoptive succession system that had produced the capable rulers of the 2nd century, for Marcus chose to be succeeded by his biological son Commodus, whose reign of 12 years would demonstrate the catastrophic consequences of hereditary succession when it produced an emperor unfit for the responsibilities of rule. The transition from Marcus Aurelius to Commodus has sometimes been identified as the moment when Roman decline began, though the true relationship between the apparent stability of the Antonine period and the crisis that followed was considerably more complex than a simple narrative of virtue succeeded by vice. The reign of Commodus, from 180 to 192 CE, introduced patterns of political instability, military adventurism, and economic disruption that would characterize the following century of Roman history. The young emperor, who succeeded to the throne at age 18, rapidly abandoned his father's northern campaigns, negotiating peace terms with the Germanic tribes that contemporaries considered shameful, but that reflected the strain that prolonged frontier warfare had placed on imperial resources. Commodus increasingly withdrew from the responsibilities of governance, delegating authority to a succession of favourites, while devoting himself to gladiatorial exhibitions in which he personally participated, adopting the persona of Hercules and demanding divine honours that scandalised traditionalist opinion. The emperor's behaviour alienated the senatorial aristocracy, whose members found themselves subjected to arbitrary execution and property confiscation, while his reliance on praetorian prefects and freedmen administrators concentrated power in the hands of courtiers whose authority depended entirely on imperial favour. The assassination of Commodus on the final day of 182 CE initiated a period of civil war and political chaos that demonstrated how completely the stability of the Antonine period had depended on the personal qualities of individual emperors, rather than the structural characteristics of Roman institutions. The year of the 5 emperors in 193 CE repeated the pattern of 69 CE, the year of the 4 emperors, revealing that the Roman army had become the ultimate arbiter of imperial succession, capable of making and unmaking emperors according to the preferences of the troops and their commanders. The eventual victor, Lucius Septimius Severus, was a provincial general of North African origin who defeated his rivals in a series of civil wars and established a dynasty that would rule the empire for more than 4 decades, from 193 to 235 CE. The Severan emperors pursued policies designed to strengthen imperial authority at the expense of the senatorial aristocracy, while simultaneously expanding the privileges of the military establishment, whose support had brought them to power. Septimius Severus famously advised his sons to enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else, a formula that reflected the new political reality in which the army had become the empire's dominant institution, its demands shaping imperial policy, and its commanders determining who would occupy the throne. The financial burden of maintaining an enlarged and increasingly expensive military establishment required the Severan emperors to resort to systematic currency debasement, reducing the silver content of the denarius to fund military operations and donatives, while initiating an inflationary spiral that would devastate the Roman economy over the following century. The Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 CE, issued by the Emperor Caracalla, granted Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire, a measure traditionally interpreted as a sign of imperial decline rather than progressive expansion of rights. The universal grant of citizenship eliminated the distinction between Romans and provincials that had previously structured imperial society, while also subjecting the newly enfranchised populations to Roman inheritance taxes that provided the treasury with additional revenue. The measure reflected the fiscal pressures facing the Severan government, which required ever greater resources to maintain the military establishment while confronting enemies on multiple frontiers. Caracalla himself was assassinated in 217 CE while campaigning against the Parthian Empire, initiating another round of civil conflict that was resolved only with the accession of his cousin Elagabalus, a teenage priest of the Syrian sun god, whose brief reign scandalized Roman traditionalists before his assassination in 222 CE. The final Severan emperor Alexander Severus attempted to restore traditional forms of governance and cooperation with the Senate, but his policies pleased neither the conservative aristocracy nor the military establishment, and his assassination in 235 CE by mutinous soldiers inaugurated the catastrophic period known to historians as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. The 50 years following the death of Alexander Severus witnessed the near-total collapse of the Roman imperial system. As the empire fractured into competing regional powers, the frontiers were breached by successive waves of barbarian invasion, and the economic and demographic foundations of Roman civilization suffered damage from which they would never fully recover. Between 235 and 284 CE, more than 50 individuals claimed the imperial title, some ruling briefly over the entire empire, others controlling only single provinces or military commands, while still others were proclaimed by ambitious soldiers and eliminated within days or weeks of their elevation. The average reign of an emperor during this period was less than 3 years, with most rulers dying violently at the hands of their own soldiers, rival claimants, or foreign enemies. The military pressures that had been building since the 2nd century intensified dramatically, with new confederations of Germanic peoples, including the Alemanni, the Franks, and the Goths, forming along the northern frontiers and launching increasingly destructive raids into Roman territory. The Sasanian Persian Empire, which had replaced the Parthian dynasty in 224 CE, proved a far more formidable opponent than its predecessor, launching aggressive campaigns that penetrated deep into the Roman East and culminated in the capture of the Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, the only Roman emperor ever to be taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. The political and military crisis was accompanied by, and to some extent caused by, a profound economic collapse that fundamentally transformed the material conditions of life throughout the Roman world. The continuous civil wars disrupted agricultural production and commercial networks, while the demands of competing claimants to the throne drained the provinces of resources needed to maintain basic infrastructure and services. The currency debasement that had begun under the Severan emperors accelerated to the point where the silver content of Roman coins became negligible, destroying the monetary economy that had facilitated trade and exchange throughout the Mediterranean basin. The collapse of the currency forced the imperial government to resort to requisitions in kind, demanding goods and services directly from the population rather than collecting taxes in coin, a system that imposed heavy burdens on provincial populations while proving far less efficient than the sophisticated fiscal mechanisms of earlier centuries. The great cities of the Roman world, which had been the centres of classical urban culture, experienced dramatic population decline as economic disruption, plague, and insecurity drove inhabitants to seek safety in rural areas or behind newly constructed defensive walls that often enclosed only a fraction of the original urban area. The demographic consequences of the 3rd century crisis were severe and long-lasting, though the absence of reliable population statistics makes precise quantification impossible. The plague of Cyprian, which struck the empire beginning around 249 CE and persisted for nearly 2 decades, killed hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of people, adding to the demographic damage caused by the Antonine Plague a century earlier and the chronic warfare that characterized the period. The population of the Roman Empire, which had perhaps reached its peak of 60 to 70 million during the 2nd century, may have declined by as much as 1/3 during the 3rd century, a loss that reduced the tax base, the military recruitment pool, and the agricultural labour force upon which Roman civilization depended. The cities bore the brunt of this demographic collapse, with urban populations declining even more sharply than rural areas as economic disruption, plague, and insecurity made city life increasingly untenable. The archaeological evidence from sites throughout the empire reveals a pattern of urban contraction, with public buildings falling into disrepair, monumental construction ceasing almost entirely, and residential areas being abandoned or converted to industrial or agricultural use. The military dimension of the 3rd century crisis involved not merely the succession of civil wars that consumed the energies of the Roman army, but fundamental changes in the nature of the external threats facing the empire that would permanently alter the strategic situation on Rome's frontiers. The Germanic peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube had been undergoing their own processes of political and military development, forming larger confederations capable of launching coordinated attacks across multiple points on the frontier, while also adopting Roman military technologies and tactics through their long interaction with the empire. The Goths, who would play such a crucial role in the final collapse of the Western Empire, first appeared as a major threat during the 3rd century, launching devastating raids across the Danube into the Balkans, and even penetrating by sea into the Aegean, where they sacked Athens, Sparta, and numerous other cities. The pressure on the northern frontiers required the concentration of Roman military resources that left other regions vulnerable, while the simultaneous threat from Sasanian Persia in the east created a two-front strategic situation that would persist until the final collapse of Western imperial authority. The capture of the Emperor Valerian by the Sasanian king Shapurwad in 260 CE represented the nadir of Roman military fortunes, revealing the catastrophic consequences of the empire's inability to defend its frontiers while simultaneously conducting internal civil wars. The fragmentation of the Roman Empire during the crisis of the 3rd century produced two breakaway states that temporarily separated from central imperial authority, demonstrating the centrifugal forces that would eventually prove fatal to Western Roman unity. The Gallic Empire, established by the usurper Postumus in 260 CE, controlled Gaul, Britain and parts of Spain for nearly 15 years, maintaining Roman administrative structures and military organisation while refusing to recognise the authority of the legitimate emperors in Rome. The Palmyrene Empire, based on the Syrian caravan city of Palmyra, emerged under the leadership of Odaenathus and his widow Zenobia, eventually controlling Syria, Egypt and much of Asia Minor, while claiming to restore Roman authority in the east against the Sasanian threat. The existence of these regional powers demonstrated that the empire's component parts possessed the administrative and military capacity to function independently of central control, a lesson that would not be forgotten when similar pressures emerged in subsequent centuries. The reunification of the empire under Aurelian in the 270s required extensive military campaigns and considerable bloodshed, while also necessitating the abandonment of the province of Dacia beyond the Danube, the first permanent contraction of Roman territory since the establishment of the Principate. The recovery of the Roman Empire from the 3rd century crisis was achieved through a fundamental transformation of Roman institutions that created what historians have termed the Dominate, distinguishing it from the Principate of the 1st and 2nd centuries. The Emperor Diocletian, who rose to power in 284 CE after defeating his rival Carinus, implemented a comprehensive program of administrative, military and economic reform designed to restore imperial authority and prevent the recurrence of the chaos that had characterized the previous half-century. The Tetrarchy, established in 293 CE, divided the empire among 4 co-emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, creating a system designed to ensure smooth succession while providing each major frontier region with its own imperial presence. Diocletian approximately doubled the size of the Roman army, creating new frontier forces and mobile field armies capable of responding to threats without stripping other sectors of their defences, while also separating military and civilian authority in the provinces to reduce the risk of provincial governors using their troops to mount usurpations. The administrative reforms divided the existing provinces into smaller units, eventually creating more than 100 provinces organised into dioceses and prefectures, with an elaborate bureaucratic hierarchy designed to ensure central control over local administration. The economic reforms of Diocletian represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt at state economic management in the ancient world, reflecting both the severity of the crisis that had preceded them and the increased capacity of the late Roman state to intervene in economic life. The Edict on Maximum Prices of 301 CE attempted to halt inflation by establishing ceiling prices for more than 1,000 goods and services, from basic foodstuffs to luxury items, with severe penalties for those who violated its provisions. The reform of the coinage attempted to restore public confidence in the monetary system through the introduction of new denominations with guaranteed metal content, though the continuing fiscal pressures facing the empire would eventually undermine these efforts. The tax system was reformed through the introduction of a census-based assessment that combined poll taxes with land taxes, with assessments revised periodically to account for changes in population and agricultural productivity. The binding of agricultural workers to their land and of urban craftsmen to their occupations, though not fully implemented during Diocletian's reign, represented an attempt to stabilise the tax base and military recruitment by preventing the population movements that had disrupted production during the crisis period. The transformation of imperial culture and ceremony under Diocletian reflected the fundamental changes in the nature of Roman rulership that the crisis had necessitated. The emperors of the Principate had maintained a fiction of partnership with the Senate and continuity with republican traditions, presenting themselves as first citizens rather than absolute monarchs. But the chaos of the 3rd century had demonstrated that such restraint was incompatible with political survival. Diocletian adopted the trappings of Oriental monarchy, appearing before his subjects in elaborate ceremonial costume, requiring prostration from those granted audience, and surrounding himself with a vast court establishment that emphasized the sacred and superhuman nature of imperial authority. The emperor was no longer princeps, first citizen, but dominus, lord and master, while his subjects were no longer fellow citizens, but servants and slaves of the divine ruler. the new religious ideology of the tetrarchic emperors emphasized their relationship with the traditional gods, particularly Jupiter and Hercules, whose protection guaranteed Roman success in war and peace, a formulation that would bring the tetrarchic government into conflict with the Christian community that refused to acknowledge the divine claims of pagan emperors. The Great Persecution of Christians, launched by Diocletian in 303 CE, represented the most systematic attempt to suppress Christianity in Roman history, reflecting both the growing visibility of the Christian community and the renewed emphasis on traditional religion as a source of imperial legitimacy. The persecution edicts ordered the destruction of churches and sacred texts, the imprisonment of clergy, and the requirement that all citizens demonstrate their loyalty by sacrificing to the traditional gods, with severe penalties including execution for those who refused compliance. The intensity of persecution varied considerably across the empire, with the eastern provinces, where Diocletian's colleague Galerius was particularly zealous, suffering far more severely than the western regions, where enforcement was often minimal or non-existent. The persecution ultimately failed to suppress Christianity, which had become too deeply rooted in the social fabric of the empire to be eliminated by administrative measures, while the steadfastness of the martyrs actually strengthened the faith of the Christian community and attracted new converts impressed by their willingness to die for their beliefs. The failure of the Great Persecution demonstrated that the Roman state, despite its enhanced coercive capacity, could not successfully impose religious uniformity on its diverse population, a lesson that would shape the religious policies of subsequent emperors. The abdication of Diocletian in 305 CE, the first voluntary retirement by a Roman emperor, was intended to demonstrate the smooth functioning of the tetrarchic succession system, but the arrangements collapsed almost immediately as the sons of the retiring emperors and various military commanders competed for power. The civil wars of 306 to 324 CE produced a new sole ruler, Constantine the Great, whose reign would transform the religious and institutional foundations of the Roman state in ways that would shape the subsequent history of both the empire and Western civilization. Constantine's victory at the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, achieved under the sign of the Christian cross according to later tradition, initiated a revolution in Roman religious policy that would within a century transform Christianity from a persecuted minority sect to the dominant religion of the empire and eventually of all Europe. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted official toleration to Christianity along with other religions, while Constantine's subsequent policies showed increasing favour to the Christian community through tax exemptions for clergy, legal privileges for the church, and the construction of magnificent basilicas in Rome, Jerusalem, Constantinople, and other major cities. The foundation of Constantinople in 324 CE created a new imperial capital that would serve as the administrative centre of the Eastern Roman Empire for more than a millennium, while also reflecting the eastward shift of the empire's political and economic centre of gravity that had been accelerating since the 3rd century. The new city, built on the site of the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium, combined natural strategic advantages with proximity to the rich eastern provinces that now provided the bulk of imperial revenues, while also offering distance from the traditional aristocracy of Rome whose conservative religious and political attitudes Constantine found increasingly inconvenient. Constantinople was designed as a Christian city from its foundation, lacking the pagan temples that dominated older Roman cities, while its churches, particularly the Great Church of the Holy Wisdom that would later be rebuilt by Justinian, proclaimed the new religious orientation of the Roman state. The transfer of the imperial residence to the east did not immediately diminish the significance of Rome, which remained the symbolic centre of the empire and the largest city in the western Mediterranean, but it initiated a process of political marginalisation that would accelerate as the western provinces became increasingly ungovernable. The reign of Constantine also witnessed institutional developments that would shape the final century of the Western Roman Empire, including the increased reliance on Germanic soldiers and officers within the Roman military establishment. The emperor recruited heavily among the Germanic peoples, both from the population of federates settled within the empire and from tribes beyond the frontiers, creating military units that retained their ethnic identity and served under their own commanders while being integrated into the Roman command structure. The so-called barbarization of the Roman army has been interpreted by some historians as a cause of later Roman collapse, with Germanic soldiers allegedly lacking the discipline and loyalty of earlier Roman legionaries. but the evidence suggests that Germanic recruits generally served effectively, and that the real problems lay elsewhere in the imperial system. Constantine's military reforms also continued the trend toward mobile field armies, the comitatenses, that could be deployed to threaten sectors, while frontier forces, the limitanes, maintained static defences along the borders, a system that would prove effective against external threats, but that also created powerful military commands whose holders could potentially challenge imperial authority. The death of Constantine in 337 CE initiated another round of dynastic conflict among his surviving sons and relatives, with the empire eventually being reunited under Constantius II before his death in 361 CE. The brief reign of Julian, the last pagan emperor, represented a final attempt to restore traditional Roman religion and roll back the institutional privileges that Constantine had granted to the Christian Church. But Julian's death during a campaign against Persia in 363 CE ended any realistic possibility of reversing the religious transformation that had occurred over the previous half-century. The emperors who followed Julian were all Christian, though their theological preferences varied, and the 4th century witnessed intense conflicts within the Christian community itself over doctrinal questions, particularly the Arian controversy concerning the nature of Christ's relationship to God the Father, that had profound political implications for the unity of the empire. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE had attempted to resolve these disputes by establishing creedal formulations that defined orthodox belief, but the theological controversies continued for generations, with successive emperors sometimes supporting the Nicene position and sometimes favouring various Arian or semi-Arian alternatives. The external situation facing the Roman Empire in the mid-4th century remained challenging despite the recovery that had occurred under Diocletian and Constantine, with continuing pressure on both the northern and eastern frontiers, requiring constant military vigilance and periodic major campaigns. The Germanic peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube had continued their processes of political consolidation during the 3rd and 4th centuries, with the Alemanni, Franks, Saxons and Burgundians emerging as major powers along the western frontiers, while the Goths and other peoples pressed against the Danube line in the Balkans. The Sasanian Empire remained a formidable opponent in the east, capable of mounting major invasions and occasionally achieving significant territorial gains, though the Romans generally succeeded in maintaining their eastern frontier through a combination of military force and diplomatic negotiation. The Roman army of the 4th century remained a highly effective fighting force, capable of conducting complex operations across great distances and defeating the enemies of the empire in most conventional engagements, though the simultaneous pressure on multiple frontiers continued to strain imperial resources and military manpower. The transformation of the Roman world would accelerate dramatically in the final decades of the 4th century, as events far beyond the empire's frontiers set in motion population movements that would ultimately prove fatal to Western Roman authority. The Huns, a nomadic people of Central Asian origin, began pressing westward across the Eurasian steppes during the 4th century, displacing the peoples in their path and creating a cascade of migrations that would eventually engulf the Roman Empire. The arrival of the Huns on the western steppe created existential pressure on the Gothic peoples, who had been Rome's neighbours along the Danube for generations, forcing them to seek refuge within the empire in numbers that would prove impossible to absorb or control. The events of the late 4th century, beginning with the Gothic crossing of the Danube in 376 CE, would initiate the final phase of Roman dissolution in the West, transforming what had been a process of gradual decline into an accelerating collapse that would culminate in the deposition of Romulus Augustulus exactly 1 century later. The Goths who appeared on the Danube frontier in the summer of 376 CE were not invaders in the traditional sense, but rather refugees fleeing the Hunnic advance across their homeland in the region north of the Black Sea. The Tervingi, one of the 2 main Gothic confederations, had been subjected to devastating attacks by Hunnic raiders that had destroyed their agricultural economy and made continued residence in their traditional territories impossible. Their king, Fritigern, led perhaps 200,000 people, including warriors, women, children, and the elderly, to the banks of the Danube, where they requested permission to cross into Roman territory and settle as federates in the Balkans. The Emperor Valens, campaigning in the east against Persia when news of the Gothic request arrived, saw an opportunity to acquire a substantial population of potential military recruits, while also demonstrating imperial benevolence toward barbarian peoples seeking Roman protection. The decision to admit the Goths would prove to be one of the most consequential in Roman history, initiating a sequence of events that would lead directly to the sack of Rome and ultimately to the extinction of Western imperial authority. The Roman officials responsible for managing the Gothic crossing faced a task of unprecedented scale, one for which neither administrative precedent nor logistical preparation had adequately prepared them. The Danube in its lower reaches presented a formidable barrier even under ordinary circumstances, with strong currents and considerable width, making organised crossings difficult to manage, and the sheer number of Goths seeking passage overwhelmed the available riverine transport capacity. The Roman military and civilian authorities along the Danube frontier had experience managing smaller groups of barbarian settlers and coordinating the admission of individual war bands seeking service in the imperial army, but nothing in their institutional memory provided guidance for processing a population movement of this magnitude. The crossing itself required weeks to complete, with available boats, rafts and improvised flotation devices pressed into continuous service, while Roman officials attempted to maintain some semblance of order and record-keeping in circumstances that defied systematic administration. Contemporary sources suggest that Roman authorities made attempts to count the crossing Goths and to separate warriors from the general population, but the chaos of the situation rendered such efforts largely futile, leaving imperial officials without accurate information about either the total number of new arrivals or the proportion of fighting men among them. The corruption and incompetence of local Roman officials transformed what might have been a manageable resettlement challenge into a catastrophic humanitarian and security crisis that would ultimately consume the Eastern Empire's military capacity. The provincial authorities responsible for feeding and settling the newly arrived Goths saw in their predicament an opportunity for personal enrichment, rather than a test of Roman administrative capability. Food supplies that had been allocated for Gothic sustenance were diverted for private profit, sold on black markets or simply withheld while the refugees starved. The desperate Goths found themselves confined in temporary holding areas without adequate provisions, forced to trade their children into slavery in exchange for dog meat and other barely edible scraps that Roman officials offered at extortionate prices. The systematic exploitation of Gothic desperation by Roman officials, who should have been facilitating their integration, generated profound and justified anger among a people who had sought Roman protection in good faith. The Goths had arrived as supplicants requesting asylum from a common enemy, and they found themselves treated as captives to be exploited rather than as potential subjects to be incorporated into the Roman system. The explosion of Gothic fury when it came demonstrated both the military capabilities that had made them valuable potential recruits and the catastrophic failure of Roman policy that had converted potential allies into existential enemies. The Tervingi under Fritigern had been joined by the Greuthungi, the other major Gothic confederation, who had crossed the Danube without permission, while Roman attention focused on managing the authorized settlement. The combined Gothic forces, numbering tens of thousands of warriors hardened by generations of warfare on the steppe frontier, found themselves with nothing to lose and everything to gain from armed resistance to Roman authority. The initial clashes between Gothic warbands and local Roman forces revealed the inadequacy of frontier garrison troops to contain a population movement of this scale and ferocity. The Goths broke out of their confinement areas and began devastating the Balkan provinces, destroying the agricultural infrastructure and civilian population centres that had sustained Roman life in the region for centuries. The situation deteriorated so rapidly that by 377 CE, the Gothic War had become the primary security concern of the Eastern Empire, demanding military resources that had been committed to other theatres and forcing fundamental reconsideration of imperial strategic priorities. The Emperor Valens recognised that the Gothic crisis required his personal attention and the commitment of the Eastern Empire's principal field army to resolve what had become an existential threat to Roman authority in the Balkans. Valens had been conducting operations against the Sasanian Empire when the Gothic crossing occurred, and the necessity of redeploying eastward against the Goths represented a significant setback for Roman interests in Mesopotamia, where hard-won advantages would gradually erode during the years when imperial attention focused elsewhere. The concentration of Roman military force required to confront the Gothic threat drew units from garrisons throughout the eastern provinces, assembling an army that contemporary sources numbered at approximately 40,000 soldiers, though modern historians regard such figures with appropriate skepticism. The Eastern Field Army that Valens led toward confrontation with the Goths in the summer of 378 CE represented the accumulated military investment of generations, a force whose destruction would leave the Eastern Empire temporarily defenceless against both external enemies and internal disorder. The campaign that culminated at Adrianople on the 9th of August 378 CE demonstrated both the continued tactical effectiveness of Roman military forces and the catastrophic consequences of strategic and operational miscalculation at the highest levels of imperial command. Valens moved his army from Constantinople toward the Gothic concentration in Thrace, conducting operations that successfully pushed the main Gothic force back toward the city of Adrianople, where intelligence indicated that Fritigern's warriors were encamped with their wagon laager, providing a fortified position around which the Gothic families and possessions were concentrated. The Roman approach to the Gothic position was conducted under conditions of extreme heat and without adequate reconnaissance of enemy dispositions, failures of military procedure that suggested either excessive confidence in Roman capabilities or insufficient respect for Gothic fighting power. The decision to engage the Gothic force without waiting for reinforcements from the Western Empire, where the Emperor Gratian was marching eastward with additional troops, reflected Valens's reported jealousy of his nephew's military reputation and his desire to claim sole credit for what he expected to be a decisive Roman victory. The Battle of Adrianople began with Roman infantry advancing against the Gothic wagon laager in the early afternoon, when the summer heat had already exhausted troops who had marched through the morning without adequate rest or provisions. The initial Roman assault against the Gothic defensive position achieved some success, with Roman infantry pressing hard against the barbarian warriors defending the wagon circle, while Gothic women and children sheltered within. The critical moment of the engagement came with the unexpected return of the Gothic cavalry, which had been away from the main encampment foraging when the Roman advance began, and whose approach had not been detected by Roman scouts. The Gothic horsemen struck the Roman right flank with devastating effect, rolling up the Roman line and trapping the legionary infantry in a compressing mass where their tactical formations became impossible to maintain. The Roman cavalry fled the field early in the engagement, leaving the infantry without the mobile forces that might have protected their flanks or covered a retreat. The destruction of the Roman army at Adrianople represented the worst military disaster suffered by Roman arms since the Battle of Cannae nearly 6 centuries earlier, and in some respects its consequences would prove more lasting than even that legendary defeat. Contemporary accounts describe the Roman infantry pressed so tightly together that soldiers could not raise their arms to wield their weapons, cut down in heaps by Gothic warriors who circled the trapped mass like hunters surrounding prey. The Emperor Valens himself died on the field, his body never recovered from among the thousands of Roman dead who covered the plain around Adrianople. The losses suffered by the Eastern Field Army were so comprehensive that modern historians estimate 2/3 of the engaged Roman force perished in the battle or in the chaotic retreat that followed, a casualty rate that left the Eastern Empire without an effective military force and opened the Balkans to unrestricted Gothic devastation. The psychological impact of the defeat extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, demonstrating that Roman arms could be catastrophically defeated by barbarian forces in pitched battle, and that the Germanic peoples were capable of destroying the empire's principal defensive instruments. The aftermath of Adrianople forced fundamental reconsideration of Roman policy toward the Gothic peoples and toward barbarian settlement within imperial territory more generally, establishing precedents that would shape the final century of Western Roman history. The new Eastern Emperor Theodosius, elevated in the crisis following Valens's death, recognized that the military resources necessary to expel or destroy the Goths simply did not exist, and that accommodation represented the only viable path forward. The treaty concluded between Theodosius and the Goths in 3182 CE established arrangements that broke decisively with traditional Roman practice regarding barbarian settlement and military service. The Goths were permitted to settle as a distinct people within Roman territory, maintaining their own laws, leaders, and military organisation, while owing service to the empire as federate allies, rather than as integrated subjects of Roman authority. The autonomous Gothic settlement established by the Treaty of 382 CE created a precedent for barbarian kingdoms within Roman territory that would be replicated throughout the Western Empire in the following century. The implications of the Adrianople disaster and its diplomatic resolution extended throughout the Roman military system, accelerating trends toward barbarization that had been developing for generations and fundamentally altering the relationship between Roman authority and military force. The catastrophic losses suffered at Adrianople could not be replaced from traditional Roman recruiting pools, which had been declining for decades due to demographic contraction and the increasing reluctance of Roman citizens to serve in the legions. The necessity of rebuilding the Eastern Field Army drove accelerated recruitment of barbarian warriors, both from the settled Gothic federates and from other Germanic peoples willing to serve Roman commanders in exchange for pay and privileges. The proportion of barbarian soldiers in Roman armies, which had been increasing throughout the 4th century, expanded dramatically in the decades following Adrianople, transforming the ethnic and cultural composition of the forces defending Roman civilization. The commanders of these increasingly barbarized armies were themselves often of Germanic origin, rising through military ranks to positions of supreme authority that their ancestors could never have imagined achieving. The reign of Theodosius the Great, extending from 379 until his death in 395 CE, represented the final period of effective unified Roman rule over both eastern and western territories, though even during his reign the practical difficulties of governing so vast an empire from a single centre had become apparent. Theodosius demonstrated considerable military and political capability in stabilising the situation created by the Adrianople disaster, concluding the Gothic settlement, rebuilding the Eastern army, and eventually defeating 2 Western usurpers to reunite the empire under his personal authority. The religious policies of Theodosius proved equally consequential for the empire's future development, as his aggressive promotion of Nicene Christianity and suppression of both Arianism and traditional paganism accelerated the transformation of Roman civilization into an explicitly Christian society. The edicts of Theodosius against pagan worship, culminating in the prohibition of all sacrifices and the closure of temples throughout the empire, represented the final victory of Christianity in its centuries-long competition with traditional Roman religion. The Christianization of Roman society under Theodosius created new sources of imperial legitimacy and social cohesion, but it also eliminated the traditional religious practices that had bound Roman communities together for a millennium. The death of Theodosius in January 395 CE initiated the permanent division of Roman authority between Eastern and Western emperors that would characterize the empire's final century, with his sons Arcadius and Honorius assuming control of the eastern and western portions respectively. The partition arranged by Theodosius followed precedents established by earlier emperors who had appointed colleagues and designated successors, but the division of 395 CE proved permanent in ways that previous arrangements had not, creating 2 separate imperial courts with distinct administrative systems and increasingly divergent interests. The young emperors who succeeded Theodosius lacked the personal authority and military experience necessary to control the powerful forces that had accumulated around the late emperor, leaving effective power in the hands of advisors and generals whose competition would destabilize both halves of the empire. The Western Empire under Honorius, who was only 10 years old at his father's death, fell under the effective control of the Magister Militum Stilicho, a general of Vandal ancestry who had served Theodosius loyally and who now attempted to preserve Roman authority in the west against mounting challenges. The Gothic federates settled by the Treaty of 382 CE had remained restive throughout the final years of Theodosius's reign, their expectations of imperial favour and military employment consistently frustrated by Roman administrators who regarded them as a conquered people rather than as valued allies. The death of Theodosius removed the personal authority that had kept Gothic discontent within manageable bounds, and within months of the emperor's passing, the Goths chose a new king, Alaric, who would prove to be one of the most consequential figures in the final dissolution of Western Roman power. Alaric had served in the Roman military and understood both the strengths and weaknesses of imperial forces, knowledge that he would employ with devastating effect in the decades of confrontation that followed. The Gothic demands under Alaric's leadership combined requests for legitimate integration into Roman military structures, including the grant of a formal command position to Alaric himself, with threats of devastating warfare if these requests were refused. The failure of Roman authorities to accommodate Gothic aspirations through meaningful incorporation into the imperial system, while simultaneously lacking the military capability to suppress Gothic power by force, created an unstable situation that could only be resolved through either genuine integration or complete separation. The early 5th century witnessed the progressive collapse of Roman military authority in the western provinces, as multiple crises overwhelmed an imperial system that lacked the resources to address simultaneous threats on every frontier. The withdrawal of Roman forces from Britain in 407 CE, necessitated by the need to concentrate military assets against continental threats, abandoned that province to the raids of Picts, Scots, and Saxons that would eventually result in the complete loss of Roman culture and Latin language in the former British provinces. The crossing of the Rhine on the last day of 406 CE by a massive coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suevi initiated the permanent barbarian occupation of the Gallic provinces, as these peoples devastated the territories through which they passed, before eventually settling in Spain and North Africa. The Roman military forces in Gaul proved incapable of preventing these incursions, or of dislodging the barbarian peoples once they had established themselves in former Roman territory. The imperial government in Ravenna, where Honorius had established his court behind the protective marshes of the Po Delta, found itself increasingly isolated from the provinces it nominally ruled, issuing orders that provincial authorities lacked either the capacity or the inclination to enforce. The repeated invasions of Italy by Alaric and his Goths during the first decade of the 5th century demonstrated the complete inadequacy of Western Roman defences and the bankruptcy of imperial policy toward the barbarian peoples, whose cooperation was essential to Roman survival. Alaric invaded Italy in 401 and again in 403, penetrating deep into the peninsula before being checked by Stilicho's forces in engagements that demonstrated continued Roman tactical effectiveness while failing to resolve the underlying strategic problem of Gothic accommodation. The execution of Stilicho in 408, ordered by Honorius in response to court intrigues that accused the general of excessive accommodation of barbarian interests, removed the one Roman commander capable of managing the Gothic threat, while simultaneously eliminating any possibility of diplomatic resolution. The massacre of barbarian families serving in the Roman military that followed Stilicho's death, carried out by Roman soldiers and civilians acting on rumours and prejudice, drove thousands of barbarian warriors to join Alaric's forces, transforming what had been a manageable Gothic warband into an army capable of conquering Italy. The sack of Rome by Alaric's Goths on the 24th of August 410 CE represented the symbolic culmination of the crisis that had begun with the Gothic crossing of the Danube 34 years earlier, demonstrating that the imperial capital itself was no longer safe from barbarian assault. The Goths occupied the city for 3 days, plundering churches, palaces, and private homes while killing those who resisted and enslaving many of the survivors. The material damage inflicted during the sack was considerable, though contemporary accounts suggest that Alaric attempted to limit destruction, and particularly to protect churches and those who sheltered within them. The psychological impact of the event far exceeded its material consequences, shattering the assumption of Roman invincibility that had persisted despite decades of military setbacks and frontier losses. The city that had conquered the Mediterranean world, that had ruled an empire stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia, that had not been occupied by a foreign enemy in 8 centuries, had fallen to barbarian warriors who camped in its forums and stripped its temples of their remaining treasures. St. Jerome, writing from his monastery in Bethlehem, expressed the sentiment of Roman Christians throughout the empire when he declared that in Rome the whole world had perished. The aftermath of the sack reverberated through the Roman world with consequences that would shape the political and religious landscape of the empire for generations to come. The Goths departed Rome after 3 days of occupation, moving southward through Italy with their plunder and their captives, including the Emperor Honorius's half-sister Galla Placidia, whose subsequent marriage to Alaric's successor would entangle Gothic and Roman dynastic politics for decades. Alaric himself died later that year in southern Italy, reportedly from fever, and was buried according to Gothic custom in the bed of the Busenta River, whose waters were temporarily diverted to conceal his grave from those who might seek to desecrate the remains of Rome's conqueror. The leadership of the Gothic people passed to his brother-in-law Ataulf, who led the Goths out of Italy and into Gaul, where they would eventually establish the Visigothic kingdom that would dominate the Iberian Peninsula for 3 centuries. The departure of the Goths from Italy provided only temporary relief to the imperial government in Ravenna, as the fundamental problems of Western defence remained unresolved, and the resources available to address them continued to diminish. The theological implications of Rome's fall proved as significant as its political consequences, generating a crisis of faith that required the greatest minds of Latin Christianity to address. The pagans who remained in the empire, though greatly diminished in numbers and influence following the Theodosian legislation against traditional worship, seized upon the disaster as evidence that the abandonment of the ancient gods had brought divine punishment upon the city they had protected for a millennium. The Christian response to this accusation required the development of a comprehensive theology of history that could account for the sufferings of the faithful within the framework of divine providence and eternal salvation. Saint Augustine of Hippo, the most influential of the Latin Church Fathers, undertook this task in his monumental work The City of God, composed over 13 years following the Gothic sack. Augustine's argument distinguished fundamentally between the earthly city, represented by Rome and all temporal political structures, and the heavenly city, the community of the faithful whose ultimate destiny transcended the rise and fall of empires. The destruction of Rome in this framework carried no ultimate significance for Christians whose true citizenship resided in an eternal kingdom that no barbarian sword could threaten or temporal disaster could diminish. This theological reinterpretation of Roman history provided the intellectual foundation for medieval Christian political thought, establishing the principle that earthly states served temporary purposes within a divine plan whose fulfillment lay beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. The Western Empire that survived the sack of 410 bore little resemblance to the unified Mediterranean state that had flourished under the Antonine emperors 3 centuries earlier. The effective territory under direct imperial control had contracted to Italy, portions of southern Gaul, and intermittent authority over regions nominally subject to Roman rule, but effectively governed by local powers or barbarian settlements. The administrative apparatus that had once coordinated the governance of territories stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates now served primarily to collect revenues from an ever-shrinking tax base, while maintaining the ceremonial pretensions of universal empire. The relationship between the imperial court at Ravenna and the barbarian peoples who now occupied most of the western provinces evolved into a complex system of treaties, subsidies, and nominal submissions that preserved the fiction of Roman sovereignty while acknowledging the reality of barbarian autonomy. The Visigoths who had sacked Rome would be settled as foederati in Aquitaine, receiving lands and formal recognition in exchange for military service against other barbarian peoples who threatened Roman territory. Similar arrangements would be negotiated with the Burgundians, who established themselves in the Rhone Valley, and eventually with other Germanic peoples whose settlements transformed the ethnic and political geography of the western provinces. The financial crisis that had plagued the Western Empire since the 3rd century intensified dramatically as the loss of provincial revenues reduced the imperial government's capacity to maintain its military establishment and administrative infrastructure. The taxation system that had sustained the professional legions and the elaborate bureaucracy of the late Roman state depended upon the productivity of provincial agriculture and the commercial activity that flowed through Mediterranean trade networks. The devastation of the Gallic and Spanish provinces by successive waves of barbarian invasion, combined with the disruption of trade routes and the flight of population from exposed regions to more defensible locations, undermined the economic foundations upon which the imperial system rested. The African provinces, which had remained relatively protected from barbarian incursion and continued to supply Rome with the grain imports essential to feeding the capital's population, represented the most valuable remaining asset of the Western Empire, making their subsequent loss to the Vandals catastrophically consequential. The imperial government responded to its fiscal difficulties through measures that accelerated the social and economic transformations already underway, including the binding of agricultural workers to the land they cultivated, the hereditary assignment of occupations and civic responsibilities, and the increasing reliance upon payment in kind rather than currency as inflation eroded the value of the coinage. The military organisation of the Western Empire underwent fundamental transformations that reflected both the changed strategic circumstances and the altered relationship between Roman authority and barbarian military power. The traditional distinction between frontier garrison troops and mobile field armies that had characterised the late Roman military establishment gave way to an increasing reliance upon barbarian forces operating under their own commanders within the framework of Roman strategic direction. The Palatine armies that served the Western emperors consisted increasingly of barbarian units whose primary loyalty attached to their immediate commanders rather than to the abstract concept of Roman imperial authority. The great military commanders of the early 5th century, men like Stilicho and his successors, maintained their positions through their ability to command the loyalty of these barbarian forces and to manage the complex diplomatic relationships with the independent peoples beyond the frontiers. The Roman military tradition that had once emphasized disciplined infantry formations, operating according to standardized tactics and logistics, gave way to cavalry-dominated warfare that reflected the military preferences of the Germanic peoples, who now constituted the majority of Western fighting forces. The reign of Honorius, which continued until his death in 423, witnessed the progressive deterioration of Western imperial authority, despite the nominal survival of the imperial office and the administrative structures associated with it. Honorius himself demonstrated little capacity for military or political leadership, preferring the security of his fortified capital at Ravenna to the dangerous uncertainties of active campaigning, and relying upon a succession of military strongmen to manage the increasingly desperate military situation. The emperor's primary contribution to imperial governance appears to have been the maintenance of court ceremonial and the preservation of the constitutional forms that legitimized the actions of those who actually wielded power in his name. The death of Stilicho in 408 had eliminated the most capable of these military managers, and his successors proved unable to match either his military skill or his diplomatic subtlety in managing the barbarian peoples upon whom Western defence increasingly depended. The recovery of Honorius's sister, Galla Placidia, from Gothic captivity following her marriage to Ataulf, and his subsequent death created a new factor in Western politics, as this strong-willed princess became the vehicle for various court factions seeking to influence imperial policy and the succession to the throne. The death of Honorius without legitimate heirs in 423 precipitated a succession crisis that demonstrated the continuing importance of Eastern recognition for Western imperial legitimacy and the complex interplay between military power and dynastic claims in the politics of the late empire. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II, son of Arcadius and nephew of Honorius, claimed the right to determine the Western succession by virtue of his seniority within the Theodosian dynasty and his position as sole remaining legitimate Augustus. The Western court initially accepted an usurper named John, a senior official whose elevation reflected the preferences of the military commanders and civil administrators at Ravenna rather than any dynastic claim. Theodosius's response demonstrated that the Eastern Empire retained both the military capacity and the political will to intervene in Western affairs when its interests demanded, as an Eastern expeditionary force descended upon Italy to eliminate the usurper and install Theodosius's chosen successor. The young Valentinian III, son of Galla Placidia, and her second husband, the general Constantius, assumed the Western throne in 425 at the age of 6, with his mother serving as regent, and the effective power held by military commanders whose ambitions and rivalries would dominate Western politics for the next 3 decades. The regency of Galla Placidia represented a remarkable episode in the political history of the late Roman West, as this princess, who had been captured by the Goths and married to their king, now governed in the name of her young son while navigating the treacherous currents of court politics and barbarian diplomacy. Placidia's position required her to balance the competing claims of powerful military commanders whose support was essential to the survival of her regime while preventing any single general from achieving a dominance that might threaten her authority or her son's inheritance. The two most significant military figures of the period, Aetius and Boniface, represented different approaches to the fundamental problem of Western defence and different relationships with the barbarian peoples whose cooperation was essential to Roman survival. Boniface, who commanded the military forces in Africa, maintained a more traditional Roman military establishment, while Aetius, who had spent time as a hostage among the Huns during his youth, relied heavily upon Hunnic military assistance and maintained close personal relationships with the Hunnic leadership. The rivalry between these two generals would eventually erupt into civil conflict that further weakened the Western Empire's capacity to address external threats, while demonstrating the degree to which personal ambition now dominated Western political calculations. The Vandal invasion of Africa in 429 represented perhaps the single most consequential territorial loss suffered by the Western Empire during the 5th century, eliminating the most economically productive provinces remaining under Roman control and threatening the grain supply upon which the population of Rome depended. The Vandals had crossed from Spain into Africa under their king Gaiseric, taking advantage of Roman internal divisions and the weakness of the African garrison to establish themselves in the wealthy provinces along the Mediterranean coast. Boniface, whose command of the African forces might have organised effective resistance, found himself recalled to Italy to face charges arising from his political rivalry with Aetius, leaving the defence of Africa to inadequate local resources. The Vandal advance proceeded with devastating effectiveness, as Gaisaric's forces captured city after city along the African coast, culminating in the fall of Carthage in 439. The loss of Africa deprived the Western Empire of approximately one-third of its remaining revenues, while simultaneously eliminating the source of the grain shipments that had fed Rome for centuries. The Western government would never recover from this blow, as the fiscal resources necessary to maintain effective military forces simply no longer existed within the diminished territories that remained under imperial control. Gaisaric proved to be among the most capable and long-lived of the barbarian kings, ruling his people for nearly 50 years and transforming the Vandal kingdom into a Mediterranean naval power, capable of threatening the coasts of Italy, Sicily and Greece. The Vandals constructed a fleet that gave them the capacity to strike at will across the western Mediterranean, raiding coastal communities and intercepting the maritime commerce that had knit together the Roman world for centuries. The traditional Roman strategy of controlling the Mediterranean through naval supremacy, which had been the foundation of Roman power since the wars against Carthage, now operated in reverse as barbarian ships commanded the sea lanes and Roman coastal cities lived in fear of sudden descents from the water. The Eastern Empire would mount several major expeditions against the Vandal kingdom over the following decades, each ending in expensive failure that demonstrated the difficulty of projecting military force against a well-established enemy operating from secure bases. The Western Empire lacked the resources for such expeditions, and could only attempt to negotiate terms with Gaisaric that might limit Vandal aggression and preserve some access to African resources, negotiations that produced only temporary and unreliable agreements. The career of Aetius dominated Western politics through the 430s and 440s, as this commander employed his Hunnic connections to maintain military superiority over potential rivals while managing the barbarian settlements in Gaul that represented the empire's best hope for defensive stability. Aetius had survived the period of Galla Placidia's greatest influence by withdrawing to Hunnic territory and returning with sufficient military force to compel accommodation with the imperial government. His subsequent campaigns in Gaul demonstrated considerable military skill, defeating various barbarian groups and containing others within defined territorial limits, while his diplomatic arrangements established a framework of Gothic, Burgundian, and Frankish settlements that preserved the fiction of Roman sovereignty while acknowledging the reality of barbarian autonomy. The key to Aetius's military position lay in his ability to summon Hunnic forces to support his campaigns, a resource that gave him overwhelming superiority over any potential rival within the Roman system, but that also made him dependent upon the continuing goodwill of the Hunnic leadership. This dependence would prove problematic when the emergence of Attila as sole ruler of the Hunnic Confederation transformed that people from potential allies into the most dangerous enemies the empire had yet faced. The rise of Attila to supreme power among the Huns represented a transformation in the nature of the Hunnic threat that would shape the final decades of the Western Empire. The Huns had maintained a loosely organised confederation under multiple chieftains since their initial appearance in Europe, their military power formidable, but their political organisation insufficient to sustain coordinated campaigns against major targets. Attila's elimination of rival leaders and concentration of authority in his own person created a unified Hunnic state, capable of directing the full military resources of the steppe peoples against targets of his choosing. The Hunnic military system, based upon the mounted archery tactics that had developed over millennia of nomadic warfare on the Central Asian steppes, represented a form of military organisation fundamentally different from the infantry-based traditions of both the Roman and Germanic military traditions. Hunnic warriors fought from horseback, employing composite bows capable of penetrating armour at considerable distances and utilising tactics of feigned retreat and ambush that exploited the superior mobility of their mounted forces. The coordination of these capabilities under unified command made Attila's forces capable of threatening both the Eastern and Western empires simultaneously, while extracting tribute payments that reflected the inability of either imperial government to resist his demands through military force. Attila's initial campaigns focused upon the Eastern Empire, whose wealthy provinces offered more attractive targets for plunder than the already devastated territories of the West. Multiple invasions of the Balkans during the 440s devastated the provinces south of the Danube, destroying cities, massacring populations, and extracting enormous tribute payments that strained even the considerable fiscal resources of the Eastern government. Constantinople itself, protected by the massive walls that Theodosius II had constructed, remained beyond Attila's reach, but the provinces that surrounded the capital were systematically plundered in campaigns that demonstrated the limitations of Roman defensive capabilities against an enemy who combined tactical superiority with strategic mobility. The Eastern government responded with a combination of military resistance, diplomatic negotiation, and tribute payment that eventually stabilized the frontier at the cost of enormous financial outlays, but that also redirected Attila's attention toward the Western Empire, which now appeared both more vulnerable and potentially equally profitable. The events that precipitated Attila's Western campaign in 451 involved the complex politics of the imperial family and the ambitions of individuals whose personal interests conflicted with the security of the state they served. Honoria, sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, had been confined to a restricted life following her involvement in a scandal at court, and in desperation she apparently sent a message to Attila proposing marriage and offering half the Western Empire as her dowry. Whether Honoria intended this communication as a serious proposal or merely as a gesture of defiance against the restrictions imposed upon her remains uncertain, but Attila chose to interpret it as a legitimate offer and demanded that Valentinian honour his sister's pledge. The Western Emperor's refusal provided the pretext for an invasion that Attila had likely intended to undertake regardless of diplomatic developments, as the concentration of Gothic, Burgundian, and other barbarian settlements in Gaul offered attractive targets for plunder, while the weakness of Western defences suggested that resistance would prove ineffective. Attila's invasion of Gaul in 451 brought together the largest military forces that Western Europe had seen since the wars of the late Roman Republic, as both the Hunnic Confederation and the coalition assembled to oppose it represented the full military potential of their respective societies. The Hunnic army that crossed the Rhine included not only the core Hunnic warriors who formed its elite forces, but also contingents from the numerous peoples who had been incorporated into Attila's confederation, or who had allied themselves with what appeared to be an irresistible force. Gothic peoples who had remained beyond Roman territory, various Germanic tribes from Central Europe, and other groups joined the Hunnic advance, creating a diverse army united only by their allegiance to Attila and their expectation of profitable plunder. The coalition that Aetius assembled to oppose this invasion included the Visigoths, under their aging king Theodoric, whose fear of Hunnic domination outweighed his resentment of Roman interference in Gothic affairs. Burgundians, Franks, and other peoples who had settled in Gaul contributed forces, along with whatever regular Roman troops remained available, creating an alliance whose cooperation reflected the desperate circumstances rather than any fundamental unity of interest. The campaign culminated at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in June of 451, an engagement whose scale and significance marked it as one of the decisive battles of late antiquity. The location of the battlefield, traditionally identified with the area near modern Châlons-en-Champagne, though the precise site remains uncertain, saw the collision of forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands according to contemporary estimates, though these figures undoubtedly reflect exaggeration typical of ancient military accounts. The course of the battle itself remains unclear in its details, as the surviving sources provide contradictory and fragmentary accounts that prevent reconstruction of tactical movements or decisive moments. What appears certain is that the fighting was extremely bloody, that both sides suffered enormous casualties, and that the battle ended with Attila's forces withdrawing from the field while the allied coalition held its positions. The Visigothic king Theodoric died during the fighting, and his death might have dissolved the alliance had not his son Thorismund been immediately acclaimed as his successor, maintaining Gothic participation in the campaign. The strategic outcome of the battle frustrated Attila's invasion of Gaul, forcing his withdrawal across the Rhine and preserving the Gallic settlement pattern that Aetius had laboured to construct. The following year witnessed Attila's invasion of Italy itself, as the Hunnic king sought to avenge his Gallic setback while exploiting the opportunity presented by the dispersal of the allied forces following their victory. Aetius found himself unable to assemble the coalition that had opposed Attila in Gaul, as the Visigoths had returned to their own territory, and other allied peoples showed little enthusiasm for further campaigning against an enemy they hoped would direct his attention elsewhere. The Hunnic advance through northern Italy proceeded largely unopposed, as city after city fell to Attila's forces in a campaign of devastation that surpassed even the destruction inflicted during previous barbarian invasions. Aquileia, the great commercial centre at the head of the Adriatic, was so thoroughly destroyed that it would never recover its former importance, and tradition held that refugees from the Hunnic destruction fled to the lagoon islands that would eventually become Venice. Milan, Pavia, and other northern Italian cities suffered similar fates, their populations killed, enslaved, or scattered, their wealth plundered, their buildings burned. The retreat of Attila from Italy without capturing Rome or Ravenna has been attributed by traditional accounts to the intervention of Pope Leo I, who met with the Hunnic king and persuaded him to withdraw through the force of his spiritual authority. More prosaic explanations have emphasized the logistical difficulties facing the Hunnic army in a devastated landscape, the outbreak of disease among his forces, and the threat posed by Eastern Roman forces that had crossed the Danube to attack Hunnic territories during Attila's absence. The combination of these factors, rather than any single cause, likely explains Attila's decision to withdraw across the Alps, preserving Rome for a few more years while leaving northern Italy devastated. Attila's death the following year, reportedly from a hemorrhage suffered during wedding celebrations for his latest marriage, removed the organising genius that had united the Hunnic Confederation and enabled its coordinated campaigns against the empires. The rapid dissolution of Hunnic power following Attila's death demonstrated how completely the Confederation had depended upon his personal leadership, as rivalries among his sons and revolts by subject peoples fragmented the Hunnic realm within a few years of his death. The destruction of Hunnic unity created new patterns of instability across the regions that had experienced Attila's dominance, as the peoples who had served under Hunnic overlordship now found themselves free to pursue their own territorial ambitions, while the power vacuum invited competition among groups that had previously maintained uneasy coexistence. The Gepids, Ostrogoths, and other peoples who had contributed forces to Hunnic campaigns now turned against one another and against the remnants of Hunnic power, creating a fluid situation along the Danube frontier that would eventually reshape the political geography of Central Europe. The Battle of Nidau in 454 or 455 marked the decisive defeat of the remaining Hunnic forces by a coalition of formerly subject peoples, ending any prospect that the Hunnic Confederation might reassemble under new leadership. The Ostrogoths, who had served as significant contributors to Hunnic military strength, emerged from this period as an independent force seeking territory and employment, their future interactions with the Roman Empire forming a crucial element of the final chapters of Western Roman history. The aftermath of the Hunnic threat found the Western Roman Empire in a condition of profound exhaustion, its Italian heartland devastated by the recent invasion, its provincial territories increasingly dominated by barbarian federates, whose cooperation depended upon continuous accommodation, rather than any sense of subordination to imperial authority. Aetius had preserved the formal structure of Roman governance in the West through his military skill and diplomatic acumen, but his achievements rested upon arrangements that required constant maintenance and could not survive the removal of his guiding hand. The circumstances of that removal illustrated the dysfunction that pervaded the Western court, as the very success that had made Aetius indispensable also made him dangerous to an emperor whose authority depended entirely upon the general's continued loyalty. Valentinian III, who had reigned as Western emperor since 425, had spent 3 decades observing Aetius's accumulation of power while remaining confined to a ceremonial role that offered prestige without genuine authority. The emperor's decision to murder Aetius personally during an audience in September of 454 reflected both the accumulated resentment of those years and a catastrophic miscalculation of the consequences. The assassination of the last great Roman general by the emperor he had served removed the only figure capable of managing the complex relationships that held together what remained of the Western Roman system. Valentinian struck down Aetius with his own sword during a meeting at the palace in Ravenna, acting upon suspicions that the general planned to establish his family in the imperial succession. Whether these suspicions reflected genuine intelligence or paranoid invention matters less than the immediate political consequences of the act, which deprived the Western Empire of military leadership at precisely the moment when such leadership remained essential for survival. The famous observation attributed to a courtier following the assassination, that the emperor had cut off his right hand with his left, captured the strategic significance of the event with brutal clarity. Valentinian had eliminated a potential rival, while simultaneously destroying the only mechanism capable of defending his throne against other threats. The consequences materialized with remarkable speed. Within months of Aetius's death, Valentinian himself was murdered by soldiers loyal to the dead general's memory, their action eliminating the Theodosian dynasty that had ruled the Roman world since 379. The death of Valentinian without legitimate male heirs opened a succession crisis that exposed the fundamental weakness of imperial authority in the West, as various factions competed to place their candidates on a throne whose actual power had become negligible. Petronius Maximus, a senator who had participated in the conspiracy against Valentinian, claimed the purple but found himself unable to establish the military support necessary to defend his position. His reign of approximately 75 days ended in chaos when the Vandal fleet appeared at the mouth of the Tiber in June of 455, fulfilling the threat that Gaiseric had represented since his establishment in Africa. The Vandal sack of Rome in 455 surpassed in thoroughness, if not in violence, the Visigothic plunder of 4 decades earlier. Where Alaric's Goths had spent 3 days in the city before withdrawing with their spoils, Gaiseric's Vandals remained for 2 weeks, systematically stripping the ancient capital of treasures that had accumulated over centuries of Mediterranean dominance. The bronze tiles that had covered the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, the sacred vessels that the Emperor Titus had brought from Jerusalem nearly 400 years earlier, the accumulated wealth of noble families and imperial collections, all were loaded aboard Vandal ships for transport to Carthage. Thousands of Romans were taken into slavery, including the widow and daughters of Valentinian III, whose captivity provided Gaiseric with both valuable hostages and claims to dynastic legitimacy through marriage arrangements. The systematic nature of the Vandal plundering reflected both the 14 days available for the work and the organisational capacity of a state that had become the dominant maritime power of the Western Mediterranean. The succession of emperors following the Vandal sack illustrated the complete collapse of imperial legitimacy in the West, as military commanders and barbarian leaders elevated and deposed rulers with increasing frequency, while the actual territory under imperial control continued to shrink. Avitus, acclaimed emperor by the Visigoths in Gaul, represented an attempt to construct imperial authority from provincial rather than Italian foundations, but his dependence upon Gothic support alienated Italian interests and led to his deposition after little more than a year. Majorian, who succeeded Avitus through the influence of the military strongman Ricimer, demonstrated both the continued potential for effective governance and the impossibility of sustaining such governance against the accumulated obstacles facing the Western state. His military campaigns against the Vandals in Africa and the Visigoths in Gaul showed skill and determination. His administrative reforms addressed genuine problems of fiscal management and provincial governance, and his efforts to rebuild Roman naval power represented a coherent strategic response to the challenges confronting the empire. Yet Majorian's very competence threatened the position of Ricimer, whose power depended upon controlling emperors rather than serving them, and the general engineered Majorian's deposition and execution in 461 after less than 4 years of reign. The pattern established by Ricimer's treatment of Majorian would characterize the remaining years of the Western Empire as barbarian military commanders exercised effective power, while emperors served as disposable figureheads whose tenure depended upon their willingness to accept subordination. Ricimer himself, whose Gothic and Suebian ancestry prevented him from claiming the purple directly, maintained his position through the successive reigns of Libius, Severus, Anthemius, and Olybrius, managing the remnants of Western Roman authority until his death in 472. The civil conflict between Ricimer and the Emperor Anthemius, which culminated in the sack of Rome by Ricimer's troops in 472, demonstrated how completely the distinction between Roman and barbarian had collapsed in the final years of the Western state. Roman troops under a barbarian commander fought against imperial forces led by an emperor appointed by Constantinople, while the civilian population of Rome suffered yet another plundering at the hands of nominal defenders. The territorial situation of the Western Empire during these final decades revealed the extent to which imperial authority had become a legal fiction covering barbarian realities. The Visigothic kingdom that Euric expanded during his reign from 466 to 484 encompassed most of the Iberian Peninsula and extended into southwestern Gaul. creating a state whose governance reflected Gothic traditions modified by Roman administrative practices. The Burgundian kingdom, established in the Rhone valley, operated under theoretical Roman suzerainty, while functioning as an independent entity whose kings issued their own law codes and pursued their own diplomatic relationships. The Vandal kingdom in Africa had been lost entirely to imperial control since the 430s, and Gaisaric's continued raids against Italian and Sicilian targets demonstrated the impotence of Western Roman naval power. Britain had been effectively abandoned since the early 5th century, its Romano-British population left to organise their own defence against Anglo-Saxon and Irish invaders, without meaningful support from imperial authorities. Only Italy itself and portions of southern Gaul remained under anything resembling direct imperial administration, and even these territories depended upon barbarian military forces whose loyalty proved contingent upon continued payment and preferment. The economic foundations of imperial governance had deteriorated in parallel with territorial losses, as the shrinkage of the tax base combined with the disruption of Mediterranean commerce to undermine the fiscal structures that had supported Roman administration and military forces. The African provinces that had supplied both grain and revenue now belonged to the Vandal kingdom, whose naval dominance simultaneously threatened Italian food supplies and interrupted the commercial networks that had integrated the Western Mediterranean economy. The Spanish provinces had ceased to contribute meaningfully to imperial treasuries, following their partition among Visigothic and Suebian kingdoms, and the Gallic provinces generated revenues that supported local barbarian rulers rather than central Roman authorities. The contraction of the monetary economy in favour of local self-sufficiency reduced both the taxable surplus available to imperial administration and the administrative capacity necessary to collect whatever taxes remained theoretically due. Imperial officials found themselves competing with barbarian kings for the loyalty and resources of provincial populations, and the results of that competition increasingly favoured the kings, who offered protection over the officials who demanded payment. The transformation of the Roman military establishment reflected these broader changes in equally dramatic fashion. The field armies that had defended the empire during its centuries of Mediterranean dominance had given way to barbarian federates whose obligations derived from negotiated agreements rather than imperial command structures. The regular units that had once formed the core of Roman military strength had either dissolved through failure of payment and recruitment, or had evolved into local forces loyal to regional commanders rather than central authorities. The distinction between Roman soldier and barbarian warrior had become largely meaningless in practical terms, as the forces that theoretically defended imperial territory consisted primarily of Germanic warriors whose equipment, tactics, and loyalties differed little from those of the barbarian kingdoms that now surrounded the remnants of the Western state. The Magister Militum who commanded these forces exercised authority that derived from his ability to maintain the loyalty of his troops, rather than from any commission received from imperial authorities, and the succession of military strongmen who dominated the final decades of the Western Empire illustrated how completely military power had become detached from constitutional legitimacy. The populations that remained under nominal imperial authority experienced these transformations in ways that varied dramatically by region, social status, and economic circumstance. The great senatorial families of Italy and Gaul continued to maintain their estates and their privileges under barbarian protection as they had under imperial rule, their cultural sophistication and administrative expertise making them valuable collaborators for rulers who sought to govern settled populations rather than merely plunder them. The relationship between Roman aristocrats and barbarian kings often proved more stable and productive than the relationship between those same aristocrats and the increasingly impotent emperors whose theoretical authority they had once served. The letters of Sidonius Apollinaris, the Gallic aristocrat who served as Bishop of Clermont during the Visigothic expansion of the 470s, revealed a world in which Roman cultural identity persisted and even flourished under circumstances that would have seemed unthinkable to earlier generations. The great estates continued to produce, the cities continued to function in reduced form, and the Christian Church continued to provide the institutional framework for community life that had become increasingly important as imperial institutions weakened. The experience of lower social orders remains more difficult to assess given the bias of surviving sources toward aristocratic perspectives, but the evidence suggests considerable variation depending upon local circumstances. The warfare and raiding that accompanied barbarian movements and Roman resistance certainly caused suffering and disruption, but the establishment of stable barbarian kingdoms often brought conditions more predictable, if not more prosperous, than the chaotic final decades of imperial authority. The tax burdens that had supported the expensive apparatus of imperial administration and military forces decreased in many areas, as barbarian rulers adopted simpler governmental structures that required less revenue. The obligations that replaced Roman taxation, including military service and various forms of tribute, imposed different burdens that fell differently across social categories without necessarily increasing total pressure on productive populations. The rural peasantry that constituted the majority of the Western population found their daily lives determined more by the immediate demands of landlords and local authorities than by the identity of the distant power that claimed ultimate sovereignty over their regions. The final years of the Western Roman Empire played out as an increasingly hollow formality, as emperors succeeded one another with rapidity, while exercising authority that had become negligible in practical terms. The elevation of Romulus Augustulus to the purple in 475 by his father, the military commander Orestes, represented merely the latest iteration of the pattern that had characterized Western imperial politics for decades. The young emperor, whose name ironically combined the legendary founder of Rome with a diminutive form suggesting his marginal significance, held a position whose formal dignity contrasted starkly with his actual powerlessness. Orestes himself had served at the court of Attila before entering Roman service, and his career illustrated the permeability of boundaries that had once seemed fundamental to Roman identity. His attempt to establish his son as emperor, while retaining effective power for himself, replicated the arrangements that Ricimer and others had employed, but the circumstances of 475 and 476 would prove different from those that had characterized previous succession crises. The forces that Orestes commanded consisted largely of barbarian federates, whose continued service depended upon expectations of reward that the shrinking resources of the Western state could no longer satisfy. The demand of these troops for land settlements in Italy, following the precedents established for barbarian federates throughout the western provinces, presented Orestes with a choice between accommodation and resistance. His decision to refuse the demands of warriors whose arms constituted the only effective military force in Italy demonstrated either principled commitment to Italian territorial integrity or political miscalculation regarding his ability to maintain loyalty without material compensation. The outcome of his decision became clear when the federates rallied behind Odoacer, a leader whose origins remained somewhat obscure but whose military reputation had earned him prominence among the mixed barbarian forces serving in Italy. The brief civil conflict that followed Orestes' refusal ended with his defeat and death near Pavia in August of 476, leaving the young Emperor Romulus without either military protection or political support. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus by Odoacer in September of 476 unfolded without the violence or drama that might be expected to accompany the end of an institution that had dominated Mediterranean civilization for 5 centuries. The young emperor, barely into his teenage years and never having exercised genuine authority, was simply set aside and sent to live in comfortable exile at a villa near Naples, where he may have survived into the 6th century. The imperial regalia, the physical symbols of authority that emperors had worn and displayed since Augustus, were sent to Constantinople with a delegation that formally acknowledged the theoretical supremacy of the Eastern Emperor while requesting that Odoacer be recognized as the legitimate ruler of Italy. The formality of this communication attempted to preserve legal continuity while acknowledging the practical reality that independent imperial authority in the West had ceased to exist. The Eastern Emperor Zeno, occupied with his own political difficulties, eventually recognized Odoacer's position while maintaining the fiction that Italy remained part of a unified Roman Empire, whose capital happened to be located in Constantinople. The significance of September 476 as the terminal date of the Western Roman Empire owes more to later historical interpretation than to contemporary perception of the event. No one at the time recorded the deposition of Romulus Augustulus as marking the fall of Rome or the end of the ancient world, because the inhabitants of the Mediterranean world had no way of knowing that no further Western emperors would emerge to challenge the new political arrangements. Previous depositions had been followed by new claimants, and the theoretical possibility of imperial restoration persisted for decades after 476. The Eastern Roman Empire continued to claim sovereignty over Western territories, and would eventually attempt to make good on those claims through the reconquest campaigns of the 6th century. the Roman Senate continued to meet and to exercise certain ceremonial functions under barbarian rule, maintaining institutional continuity that blurred any sharp boundary between Roman and post-Roman governance. The administrative structures, legal traditions, and cultural practices that had characterized Roman civilization persisted under Germanic rulers who often sought to present themselves as continuators rather than destroyers of the Roman legacy. Yet the absence of a Western emperor after 476 marked a genuine transformation whose significance becomes clearer in retrospect than it would have appeared to contemporaries. The institution that had governed the Western Mediterranean for 5 centuries, that had built the roads and aqueducts and cities that still structured Mediterranean life, that had created the legal and administrative frameworks within which millions of people had lived and worked and died, had ceased to function. The forces that had produced this outcome, the military pressures from beyond the frontiers, the fiscal constraints that limited governmental capacity, the political fragmentation that prevented coordinated response to accumulated challenges, the social and economic transformations that had shifted the foundations of Mediterranean civilization, had operated over centuries rather than years. The deposition of one more powerless emperor by one more barbarian military commander represented the final expression of processes that had been underway for generations, the quiet conclusion to a transformation that had long since become irreversible. The world that emerged from the transformation of the Western Roman Empire retained far more continuity with its Roman past than the dramatic language of fall might suggest, even as it differed fundamentally from the integrated Mediterranean civilization that had characterized the imperial centuries. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced imperial administration in the West built upon Roman foundations while adapting them to changed circumstances and different cultural traditions. The Christian Church that had become integral to Roman civilization survived and flourished under barbarian rulers who generally accepted Christianity and patronized ecclesiastical institutions. The Latin language that had served as the medium of Roman administration and culture continued to function in modified forms that would eventually develop into the Romance languages of medieval and modern Europe. The legal traditions codified in Roman law persisted in various adaptations, influencing the law codes that barbarian kings promulgated for their mixed populations. The cities that had served as nodes of Roman administration continued to function in reduced form, their bishops often assuming responsibilities that imperial officials had once exercised. The transformation of Mediterranean civilization from Roman imperial structures to the successor kingdoms of the early medieval period proceeded through patterns that varied considerably across different regions, while sharing certain common characteristics that reflected the underlying conditions of the post-imperial world. The Italian peninsula under Odoacer's rule demonstrated perhaps the most conservative pattern of transition, with existing administrative arrangements preserved to a remarkable degree, even as the ultimate source of political authority shifted from Roman emperors to Germanic kings. The Roman Senate continued to function in its traditional ceremonial and advisory capacity, its aristocratic members maintaining the social prestige and considerable landed wealth that had characterized the senatorial order for centuries. The prefect of Rome continued to exercise administrative responsibilities within the city, and the various offices that had managed urban services, grain distribution, and public entertainment persisted under the new political dispensation. Odoacer's own position remained somewhat ambiguous, as he avoided the title of king for some years while ruling Italy, in a manner that preserved the outward forms of Roman governance, even as it substituted barbarian military authority for the theoretical sovereignty of distant emperors. The administrative continuity that characterized Odoacer's Italy reflected both practical necessity and deliberate policy choices that would be replicated in various forms throughout the successor kingdoms. The Germanic warriors who had established themselves as the military elite of post-Roman Western Europe possessed neither the numbers nor the administrative expertise to govern complex Mediterranean societies through purely Germanic institutions. The Roman provincial administration, with its experienced officials, established procedures, and functioning tax collection mechanisms, represented an invaluable resource that pragmatic barbarian rulers had every incentive to preserve and utilize. The Roman landowners and civic leaders who had managed local affairs under imperial authority continued to perform similar functions under barbarian kings, creating patterns of collaboration between Germanic military elites and Roman civilian administrators that characterized the transition period throughout the West. This collaboration was facilitated by the religious common ground that Christianity provided. as the acceptance of Christianity by most barbarian groups created shared cultural reference points and institutional connections that bridged ethnic and social divisions. The Ostrogothic kingdom that succeeded Odoacer's rule in Italy following Theodoric's conquest in 493 represented an even more deliberate attempt to preserve and continue Roman traditions under Germanic royal authority. Theodoric had spent a decade of his youth as a hostage at the Eastern Roman court in Constantinople, an experience that had provided him with detailed knowledge of Roman administrative practices and genuine appreciation for Roman cultural achievements. His conquest of Italy, undertaken with the encouragement of the Eastern Emperor Zeno as a means of removing a troublesome Gothic presence from the Balkans, while simultaneously eliminating Odoacer's independent regime, established a kingdom that consciously modelled itself on Roman precedents, while acknowledging the changed circumstances of the post-imperial world. The Ostrogothic administration maintained Roman institutions with remarkable fidelity, employing Roman aristocrats in senior governmental positions, and preserving the traditional cursus honorum that had structured elite careers for centuries. The Roman Senate retained its ceremonial functions and social prestige, and Roman law continued to govern relations among the Roman population, while Gothic customary law applied to disputes among the Gothic warriors. Theodoric's Italy demonstrated that the transformation of the Western Roman world need not involve the destruction of Roman civilization, but could instead produce synthesis between Roman and Germanic traditions that preserved essential elements of the classical heritage. The king himself, though ruling as an Arian Christian whose religious beliefs differed from the Nicene Christianity of his Roman subjects, maintained religious tolerance and patronized Roman cultural institutions. He sponsored building projects that maintained Roman architectural traditions, commissioned mosaics and other artistic works that demonstrated sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities, and employed Roman literary figures such as Boethius and Cassiodorus in positions of governmental responsibility. The correspondence that Cassiodorus conducted on behalf of the Ostrogothic kings, preserved in his collection known as the Variae, demonstrates the elaborate rhetorical traditions that continued to characterize official communications and the degree to which Roman administrative language and concepts persisted under Gothic rule. The Ostrogothic kingdom represented in many respects the most successful attempt to bridge the transition from Roman to post-Roman governance, while preserving maximum continuity with the classical past. Yet the Ostrogothic synthesis ultimately proved fragile, vulnerable both to internal religious tensions between Arian rulers and Catholic subjects, and to the external threat posed by the Eastern Roman Empire's continuing claims to sovereignty over Western territories. The Emperor Justinian's reconquest campaigns, initiated in 533 with the swift destruction of the Vandal kingdom in Africa and extended to Italy beginning in 535, reflected the persistence of imperial ideology that viewed the barbarian kingdoms as temporary usurpations to be corrected when circumstances permitted. The Gothic wars that ravaged the Italian peninsula for nearly 2 decades represented a catastrophe that exceeded anything the peninsula had experienced during the initial barbarian settlements, as systematic campaigns of siege warfare and scorched earth tactics devastated cities and countryside alike. The city of Rome itself changed hands multiple times during the conflict, its population declining precipitously as the violence and disruption of prolonged warfare made urban life increasingly untenable. The Roman Senate, that ancient institution whose continuity had bridged the transition from republic to empire and from empire to barbarian kingdom, effectively ceased to function as its members scattered or perished amid the chaos of the Gothic wars. The ultimate Eastern Roman victory over the Ostrogoths by 554 restored Italy to imperial rule, but the Italy that Justinian's generals reconquered bore little resemblance to the prosperous peninsula that Theodoric had governed half a century earlier. The infrastructure of Roman urban civilization had suffered devastating damage, from which recovery would prove impossible under the conditions of the 6th century. The population had declined dramatically, both from the direct violence of the campaigns and from the disruption of agricultural and commercial systems that sustained Mediterranean society. The Eastern Roman administration that attempted to govern the reconquered territories lacked the resources to rebuild what had been destroyed, and the continued military pressure from the Lombards, who invaded Italy in 568, would eliminate Eastern Roman control over most of the peninsula within a generation. Justinian's reconquest, intended to restore Roman unity and civilization, had instead accelerated the transformation of Italy from a centre of classical civilization to a fragmented medieval landscape of competing political authorities, declining cities, and contracting economic networks. The pattern of transformation that characterized Italy found parallels throughout the former Western provinces, though the specific circumstances varied considerably according to local conditions, the particular barbarian groups involved, and the degree to which Roman administrative structures had survived the initial transitions. The Visigothic kingdom that dominated the Iberian Peninsula from the early 5th century onward demonstrated its own distinctive pattern of Romano-Germanic synthesis, as Visigothic kings gradually adopted Roman administrative practices while maintaining separate legal traditions for Gothic and Roman populations. The conversion of the Visigothic monarchy from Arian to Catholic Christianity under King Recred in 518 eliminated the religious division that had complicated relations between Gothic rulers and their predominantly Catholic Roman subjects, creating conditions for more thorough integration between the two populations. The Visigothic law codes that emerged during the 6th and 7th centuries represented increasingly sophisticated attempts to harmonise Gothic and Roman legal traditions, culminating in the Liber Judiciorum of 654, which created a unified legal system applicable to all inhabitants of the kingdom, regardless of ethnic origin. The Frankish kingdom that emerged in Gaul under Clovis and his successors represented perhaps the most significant of the successor states, establishing a political tradition that would eventually produce the Carolingian Empire and shape the development of medieval Western Europe. The Franks' acceptance of Catholic Christianity from the outset of their expansion into Roman Gaul, rather than the Arian Christianity that characterized most other Germanic groups, facilitated their integration with Roman ecclesiastical structures and their acceptance by the Gallo-Roman population. The alliance between Frankish kings and the Catholic episcopate that characterized the Merovingian period created patterns of collaboration between secular and ecclesiastical authority that would influence the political development of medieval Europe for centuries. The Roman administrative traditions that survived in Gaul became intertwined with Frankish royal institutions, producing hybrid governmental forms that preserved certain classical elements while adapting them to the different circumstances of the post-Roman world. The transformation of the Western Mediterranean from Roman imperial civilization to the successor kingdoms of the early medieval period involved not merely political changes but fundamental shifts in the social and economic structures that had sustained classical civilization. The urban networks that had characterized Roman society underwent dramatic contraction throughout the post-imperial West, as cities that had flourished during the imperial centuries declined to fractions of their former populations or were abandoned entirely. The economic foundations that had sustained urban life, the long-distance trade networks, the specialized manufacturing, the surplus agricultural production that provisioned non-farming urban populations, contracted as the political fragmentation of the post-Roman world disrupted the integrated Mediterranean economy that had characterized the imperial period. The roads that Roman engineers had constructed to facilitate military movement and administrative communication fell into disrepair as the central authority responsible for their maintenance ceased to function, and travel became more difficult and dangerous as the security that imperial administration had provided gave way to the localized violence of competing political authorities. The contraction of urban life and long-distance commerce that characterized the post-Roman West represented a genuine transformation of Mediterranean civilization, even if the changes occurred gradually rather than catastrophically. Cities that had supported populations in the tens of thousands during the imperial centuries declined to communities of a few thousand or even a few hundred, their extensive urban fabric becoming depopulated and their great public buildings falling into ruin or being repurposed for more modest uses. The Roman Forum, that centre of civic life around which classical urban culture had organised itself, ceased to function as a gathering place for political assembly and commercial exchange, its spaces often becoming gardens, cemeteries, or the sites of new ecclesiastical construction that reflected the changed priorities of post-Roman society. The great baths that had served as centres of Roman social life fell into disuse as the water supply systems that had fed them deteriorated, and as the bathing culture that had characterised Roman civilization gave way to different patterns of personal care. The theatrical and gladiatorial entertainments that had occupied Roman leisure time ceased as the economic surplus necessary to support such elaborate productions disappeared, and as Christian moral teaching discouraged participation in spectacles associated with pagan traditions. The transformation of urban culture reflected and reinforced broader changes in social organisation that characterised the transition from Roman to medieval society. The classical pattern of urban residence by wealthy landowners, who maintained townhouses where they participated in civic life while deriving their income from rural estates, gave way to more thoroughly rural patterns of elite residence as the attractions of urban life diminished, and the security concerns of the post-Roman world encouraged landowners to focus their attention on their estates. The great aristocratic families who had dominated Roman society adapted to changed circumstances by consolidating their control over rural territories while withdrawing from active participation in the diminished urban centres. The bishops who presided over urban Christian communities increasingly assumed the civic leadership roles that secular officials had once exercised, becoming the primary representatives of urban interests and the principal intermediaries between urban populations and the barbarian rulers who now exercised political authority. The ecclesiastical institutions that survived and flourished through the transformation of the Roman world provided crucial continuity between classical and medieval civilization, preserving Roman cultural traditions, maintaining Latin literacy, and transmitting the intellectual heritage of antiquity to subsequent centuries. The monasteries that proliferated throughout the post-Roman West became centres of learning and literary production, as secular educational institutions declined, their scriptoria preserving and copying the texts that would transmit classical knowledge to medieval and modern readers. The episcopal schools that trained clergy for service in the church maintained Latin grammatical education even as secular literacy declined, ensuring that the language of Roman administration and culture would persist as the medium of ecclesiastical communication and learned discourse. The church councils that convened throughout the barbarian kingdoms maintained connections between geographically dispersed Christian communities, creating networks of communication and institutional coordination that partially compensated for the fragmentation of secular political authority. The persistence of Roman cultural traditions within Christian institutional frameworks created the conditions for the eventual cultural revival that would characterise the Carolingian period and lay the foundations for medieval European civilization. The Latin language that the Church preserved as its liturgical and administrative medium would develop into the Romance vernaculars that became the native languages of much of Western Europe, while simultaneously persisting as a learned language that facilitated communication across linguistic boundaries for more than a millennium. The Roman law that the Church preserved in various adaptations would influence the development of both canon law and secular legal traditions throughout the medieval period, providing frameworks for legal reasoning and institutional organisation that built upon classical precedents. The classical texts that monastic libraries preserved, however imperfectly and selectively, would provide later generations with access to ancient philosophy, literature, and learning that would prove essential for the intellectual developments of the high medieval and Renaissance periods. The gradual nature of the Western transformation and the genuine continuities that linked Roman and post-Roman society complicate any simple narrative of decline and fall, even as they should not obscure the reality of fundamental change that the dissolution of the Western Empire represented. The world of the 6th and 7th centuries differed profoundly from the world of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and these differences reflected not merely superficial political changes, but deep transformations in economic organisation, social structure, and cultural orientation. The integrated Mediterranean economy that had sustained classical urban civilization had fragmented into more localized economic units, whose reduced productivity limited the possibilities for specialized production and long-distance exchange. The military security that imperial frontiers had provided had given way to chronic insecurity that encouraged the fortification of settlements and the localization of political authority. The civic culture that had organized Roman social life around public participation in urban institutions had yielded to a more privatized existence centered on household, estate, and religious community. The Eastern Roman Empire that persisted after 476 demonstrated that the decline of Roman power was not inevitable, but rather reflected specific circumstances that affected the western provinces more severely than the eastern regions. Constantinople continued to function as an imperial capital, governing territories that extended from the Balkans to Egypt and from the Adriatic to the Euphrates. The eastern provinces had avoided the worst of the barbarian settlements that had transformed the western social and political landscape, maintaining stronger continuity with Roman administrative traditions and preserving more robust urban and commercial networks. The Eastern emperors continued to claim sovereignty over the entire Roman world, viewing the barbarian kingdoms as temporary usurpations to be corrected when circumstances permitted. The continuing vitality of the Eastern Empire would sustain Roman political traditions for another millennium, until the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 finally extinguished the Byzantine continuation of the Roman state. The contrast between Eastern continuity and Western transformation illuminates the specific factors that had produced the dissolution of Roman power in the West. The Eastern provinces possessed certain structural advantages that had helped them weather the crises of the 3rd and 4th centuries more successfully than their Western counterparts. The greater urbanization and commercialization of the Eastern Mediterranean had created more resilient economic foundations that could sustain governmental extraction and military expenditure more effectively than the more agrarian economy of the Western provinces. The strategic position of Constantinople, protected by formidable walls and accessible by sea, provided a degree of security that no Western capital could match. The relative absence of major barbarian settlements within Eastern provincial territory preserved the tax base and administrative infrastructure upon which imperial power depended. The greater availability of naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean facilitated the defence of coastal territories and the maintenance of commercial connections that continued to sustain urban prosperity. Yet the Eastern survival should not be attributed entirely to structural advantages, as the policy choices made by Eastern emperors also contributed to their more successful navigation of the challenges that confronted the late Roman state. Eastern emperors proved more willing to accommodate barbarian groups through diplomacy and subsidy rather than direct confrontation, managing the pressures from beyond the frontiers through flexible strategies that avoided the catastrophic military defeats that had punctuated Western history. The Eastern government maintained more effective control over its military establishments, avoiding the pattern of barbarian military dominance that had characterized Western politics throughout the 5th century. The greater fiscal resources available to Eastern emperors allowed them to maintain professional military forces and to pursue the diplomatic and strategic flexibility that successful management of barbarian relations required. The combination of structural advantages and effective policy choices enabled the Eastern Roman Empire to maintain coherent governmental authority across its territories, while the Western provinces fragmented into the successor kingdoms of the early medieval period. The fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire into successor kingdoms did not occur according to any predetermined pattern, but rather emerged from the accumulated decisions and circumstances of the 5th century's turbulent decades. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa, the Visigothic kingdom in Spain and southern Gaul, the Burgundian kingdom in the Rhone Valley, the Frankish territories in northern Gaul, and the Ostrogothic kingdom that would eventually emerge in Italy, each possessed distinctive characteristics that reflected the particular circumstances of their establishment and the specific nature of the relationship between barbarian military elites and surviving Roman populations. These kingdoms were not simple conquests that replaced Roman civilization with Germanic barbarism, but rather complex amalgamations that combined elements of both traditions in varying proportions depending on local conditions and the policies of individual rulers. The Roman populations that found themselves under barbarian governance experienced their new circumstances in ways that varied considerably according to their social position, geographic location, and the specific character of the barbarian regime under which they lived. The administrative continuity that persisted within many of the successor kingdoms demonstrated the practical necessity of Roman governmental expertise for rulers whose military capabilities far exceeded their administrative sophistication. Barbarian kings required the revenue that Roman taxation systems could provide, the legal frameworks that Roman jurisprudence had developed, and the literate personnel that Roman educational traditions had produced. The Roman aristocrats who had administered the western provinces under imperial authority frequently continued to serve under barbarian kings, maintaining their social positions and their cultural traditions, even as political sovereignty passed to Germanic rulers. The correspondence of figures such as Sidonius Apollinaris, who served as Bishop of Clermont under Visigothic overlordship, reveals the complex negotiations through which Roman elites adapted to the new political dispensation while preserving as much of their traditional way of life as circumstances permitted. the church provided a particularly important venue for the continuation of Roman cultural traditions, as ecclesiastical institutions offered opportunities for aristocratic service and cultural preservation that secular governmental positions increasingly could not provide. The theological dimensions of the relationship between Roman populations and barbarian rulers complicated the process of accommodation that the political circumstances required. The majority of the barbarian peoples who settled within the western provinces had adopted Christianity before their entry into Roman territory, but they had received their Christianity in the Arian form that the missionary Ulfila had brought to the Goths during the 4th century. The doctrinal differences between Arian Christianity and the Nicene Christianity practiced by the Roman population created a religious division that reinforced the ethnic and legal distinctions between the two communities. Barbarian kings who sought to maintain their distinctiveness from their Roman subjects found in Arian Christianity a religious identity that marked them as separate from the Catholic populations they governed, while Roman bishops who resisted barbarian authority could frame their opposition in theological terms that carried supernatural sanction. The eventual conversion of the barbarian kingdoms to Catholic Christianity would prove essential to the fuller integration of the two populations, though this process extended across multiple generations and occurred according to different timelines in different kingdoms. The economic transformations that accompanied the political fragmentation of the Western Empire gradually altered the material foundations upon which classical civilization had rested. The decline of long-distance trade reduced the variety of goods available in Western markets and encouraged the development of more localized economic relationships centered on agricultural production for immediate consumption rather than commercial exchange across extended distances. The contraction of urban populations reflected both the reduced economic opportunities that the disruption of commercial networks had created and the increased insecurity that made concentrated settlement in unfortified towns increasingly dangerous. The great cities of the Western Empire either shrank dramatically or disappeared entirely, their populations dispersing into the countryside or concentrating in fortified settlements that bore little resemblance to the thriving urban centres of the imperial period. Rome itself, which had housed a population approaching 1 million during the height of imperial prosperity, declined to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants by the 6th century, its monumental architecture gradually falling into ruin as the economic and social systems that had sustained the city's greatness ceased to function. The transformation of the Roman landscape during the 5th and 6th centuries reflected the broader changes in social organisation and economic activity that the political fragmentation had accelerated. The villa complexes that had dominated the rural landscape of the western provinces during the imperial period increasingly fell into disuse as the social and economic conditions that had sustained them changed. The large-scale agricultural operations that had characterized Roman estate management gave way to more fragmented patterns of land use as the labour systems and market relationships upon which they had depended broke down. The forests and wastelands that had been cleared during the centuries of Roman expansion began to reclaim territories that had been under cultivation, as reduced population pressure and the disruption of agricultural markets reduced the incentives for intensive land use. The physical infrastructure that the Roman state had constructed and maintained deteriorated in the absence of the governmental resources and organised labour that their upkeep required. Roads fell into disrepair, bridges collapsed, aqueducts ceased to function, and the physical monuments of Roman power slowly crumbled into the ruins that would fascinate later generations seeking to understand the greatness that had been lost. The cultural continuities that persisted through the political transformations of the 5th century proved more resilient than the material infrastructure that had supported classical civilization. The Latin language continued to serve as the medium of educated communication throughout the Western territories, evolving gradually into the Romance languages that would eventually emerge but maintaining its literary and liturgical functions across the centuries of transformation. The educational traditions that had transmitted classical learning from generation to generation survived within the ecclesiastical institutions that became the primary repositories of literacy and scholarship in the post-Roman West. The monasteries that multiplied throughout the Western territories during the 6th and 7th centuries served as centres of cultural preservation, their scriptoria copying and preserving the manuscripts that would transmit the literary heritage of antiquity to later generations. The Church's need for literate clergy ensured that the skills of reading and writing would not be entirely lost, even as the broader educational system that had produced the cultivated elite of the Roman world contracted to serve primarily religious purposes. The legal traditions of the Roman world demonstrated particular staying power within the successor kingdoms, as the practical requirements of governance necessitated systematic frameworks for resolving disputes and regulating social relationships. The codes of law that the barbarian kings promulgated combined Germanic customary practices with Roman legal principles in proportions that reflected the particular circumstances of each kingdom. The Visigothic Code, the Burgundian law, and the Frankish legal compilations each represented attempts to create workable legal frameworks for societies that combined populations with different legal traditions and different expectations regarding justice and social order. The personnel who drafted these compilations and administered justice according to their provisions were frequently Roman jurists whose expertise the barbarian rulers could not replicate from among their own peoples. The continuing influence of Roman law within the successor kingdoms ensured that fundamental legal concepts regarding property, contract and personal status would persist through the centuries of political fragmentation, eventually contributing to the medieval legal synthesis that would shape the development of European jurisprudence. The political history of the successor kingdoms during the decades following the deposition of Romulus Augustulus demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of barbarian governance in the post-Roman West. The Ostrogothic kingdom that Theodoric established in Italy, following his defeat of Odoacer in 493, represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt to combine barbarian military power with Roman administrative tradition. Theodoric presented himself as a legitimate successor to the Western emperors, maintaining the forms of Roman governance, patronizing the arts and letters, and pursuing policies designed to preserve the prosperity and cultural life of the Italian peninsula. The 33 years of his reign witnessed a remarkable revival of Roman civilization under Gothic auspices, as Theodoric employed Roman administrators such as Cassiodorus and Boethius to manage the governmental apparatus, while his Gothic warriors provided the military security that the peninsula had lacked during the chaotic final decades of Western imperial rule. The churches and public buildings that Theodoric constructed in Ravenna testified to his ambition to present himself as a worthy custodian of Roman civilization, while his correspondence with other barbarian kings demonstrated his conception of himself as the leading figure in a new political order that had replaced the unified empire. Yet the Ostrogothic experiment ultimately proved unsustainable, as the tensions inherent in the relationship between Gothic military elite and Roman civilian population could not be permanently resolved through even the most enlightened royal policy. The religious division between Arian Goths and Catholic Romans created a fundamental barrier to the integration of the two communities that Theodoric's later reign increasingly revealed. The execution of Boethius on charges of treason in 524 and the subsequent death of his father-in-law Symmachus demonstrated the fragility of the accommodation that had characterized the earlier years of Theodoric's rule. The king's death in 526 inaugurated a period of dynastic instability that weakened the Gothic regime precisely when the Eastern Roman Empire under Justinian was preparing to reassert imperial authority over the lost Western territories. The Gothic wars that erupted in 535 and continued for nearly 2 decades devastated the Italian peninsula more thoroughly than any of the barbarian invasions that had preceded them, destroying the prosperity that Theodoric's reign had briefly restored and reducing Italy to a condition of exhaustion from which recovery would require centuries. The reign of Justinian represented the most ambitious attempt to reverse the political fragmentation of the 5th century and to restore the territorial unity that the Roman Empire had once possessed. The Eastern Emperor's reconquest of North Africa from the Vandals in 533-534, his prolonged campaign to recover Italy from the Ostrogoths, and his seizure of coastal Spain from the Visigoths reflected a conception of imperial restoration that denied the permanence of the Western settlement. Justinian's legal codification, which systematized and preserved the jurisprudence of the classical Roman tradition, demonstrated his commitment to maintaining the institutional and cultural heritage of the Roman state. His building program, which produced the great church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, along with numerous other monuments throughout his territories, testified to imperial resources and ambitions that exceeded anything the Western Empire had been able to muster during its final century. Yet Justinian's reconquest proved ultimately counterproductive, exhausting the Eastern Empire's resources in campaigns that destroyed more than they preserved and establishing imperial authority over territories too devastated to contribute meaningfully to the empire's strength. The decades following Justinian's death in 565 revealed the limitations of the Eastern Empire's capacity to maintain the territorial gains his reign had achieved. The Lombard invasion of Italy, beginning in 568, rapidly dismembered the recently reconquered peninsula, establishing a barbarian kingdom that would dominate northern and central Italy for the next 2 centuries, while reducing the imperial presence to scattered coastal enclaves in the southern regions. The Visigothic kingdom recovered the Spanish territories that Justinian had seized, while new threats from Persia and from the Slavic peoples pressing into the Balkans absorbed the military resources that might otherwise have been devoted to maintaining the western reconquests. The Eastern Empire that emerged from the crises of the late 6th and 7th centuries bore increasingly little resemblance to the Roman state that had governed the Mediterranean world during the classical period. The loss of Egypt, Syria, and North Africa to the Arab conquests of the 7th century completed the transformation, reducing the empire to a primarily Greek-speaking state centred on Anatolia and the Balkans that would persist for another 8 centuries as the Byzantine continuation of the Roman tradition, but that had fundamentally departed from the universal Mediterranean empire that Rome had once represented. The question of when and why Rome fell has occupied historians since the process of decline first became apparent to contemporary observers during the troubled 3rd century. The 18th century historian Edward Gibbon famously attributed the fall to the combined effects of barbarism and religion, viewing the empire's decline as a consequence of the moral and civic innovation that Christianity had promoted, and the military pressure that the barbarian peoples had applied. Subsequent generations of scholars have proposed alternative explanations that emphasize economic factors, environmental changes, administrative failures, military transformations, demographic decline, or some combination of these elements. The complexity of the historical process resists simple monocausal explanation, as the fall of Rome resulted from the interaction of multiple factors that operated across different timescales and affected different regions in different ways. The structural problems that had characterized the Roman state since at least the 3rd century created vulnerabilities that the specific pressures of the 4th and 5th centuries exploited, while the decisions made by individual emperors, generals and barbarian leaders shaped the particular form that the Western collapse assumed. The meaning of Rome's fall for subsequent generations extended far beyond the scholarly debates regarding its causes. The memory of the Roman Empire haunted medieval Europe as an image of lost unity and grandeur that successive political projects sought to recapture or emulate. Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800, the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire under the German kings, and the persistent claims of the Byzantine emperors all represented attempts to maintain connection with the Roman heritage that retained its legitimating power centuries after the Western Empire had ceased to exist. The legal, linguistic and architectural inheritance of Rome continued to shape European civilization throughout the medieval and modern periods, while the political thought of the Renaissance and Enlightenment frequently invoked Roman precedents as models for contemporary governance. The fall of Rome became not merely a historical event, but a paradigm of civilizational decline that informed European reflections on the mortality of political orders and the transience of human achievement. The transformation that separated the ancient world from the medieval world occurred not through a single catastrophic event, but through the accumulation of changes that gradually altered every aspect of Mediterranean civilization. The political unity that the Roman state had provided gave way to a plurality of kingdoms and principalities whose conflicts and alliances would shape the political geography of medieval Europe. The urban civilization that had characterized the classical Mediterranean yielded to a more rural pattern of settlement, in which the castle and the monastery replaced the forum and the bath as the characteristic institutions of social life. The civic culture that had organized classical society around public participation in municipal institutions gave way to a more hierarchical social order in which lordship and vassalage defined the relationships between individuals and communities. The classical educational tradition that had transmitted the literature and philosophy of Greece and Rome contracted to serve primarily religious purposes within ecclesiastical institutions. The integrated Mediterranean economy that had sustained classical urban prosperity fragmented into more localized economic units whose reduced productivity supported smaller populations at lower material standards. The world that emerged from these transformations differed so profoundly from the world that had preceded them that historians have found it necessary to employ the distinction between antiquity and the Middle Ages to describe the magnitude of the change. The final extinguishing of the Western Roman Empire in 476 marked not the beginning, but the culmination of a process of decline that had extended across 2 centuries, and that had affected every dimension of Roman civilization. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus represented the formal acknowledgement of a political reality that had already been established through the gradual transfer of effective power from imperial institutions to barbarian military leaders and the progressive fragmentation of Western territory into successor kingdoms. The young emperor who bore the names of Rome's legendary founder and its greatest imperial dynasty had possessed no more real authority than the phantom emperors who had preceded him during the chaotic final decades of Western rule, and his removal from power changed nothing essential about the political conditions that prevailed in the Italian peninsula. Yet the symbolic significance of the event transcended its immediate political consequences, as the extinction of the Western imperial line confirmed the end of an era that had begun when Augustus had established the Principate 5 centuries earlier. The Roman Empire that had unified the Mediterranean world created a common civilization across 3 continents, and provided the political framework within which classical culture had reached its highest development had finally ceased to exist as a political entity in the western half of its former territories. The legacy of Rome endured not through the continuation of its political institutions, but through the persistence of the cultural, legal and religious forms that Roman civilization had developed and transmitted to its successors. The Latin language that Rome had spread across Western Europe continued to shape the intellectual and religious life of medieval Christendom, and eventually evolved into the Romance languages that hundreds of millions of people speak today. The legal principles that Roman jurists had elaborated contributed to the development of the European legal tradition, and continue to influence modern jurisprudence across much of the world. The Christian Church that had emerged within the Roman Empire and received official recognition under Constantine preserved elements of Roman administrative organisation and cultural tradition throughout the medieval period, maintaining Latin as its liturgical language and perpetuating educational practices that transmitted classical learning to successive generations. The memory of Roman political unity haunted European civilization for centuries, inspiring successive attempts to recreate the empire's territorial scope and governmental effectiveness. The fall of Rome thus marked not the disappearance of Roman influence, but rather the transformation of that influence from a living political presence into a cultural inheritance that would shape the development of European and eventually global civilization across the millennia that followed. Odoacer's decision to send the imperial regalia to Constantinople, rather than claiming the Western throne for himself or installing another puppet emperor, acknowledged a political reality that had been apparent for decades, but that no previous barbarian commander had been willing to formalize. The gesture recognized that effective imperial authority in the West had long since ceased to exist, and that the fiction of Western emperorship served no practical purpose that could justify its continuation. The Eastern Emperor Zeno accepted the regalia and the theoretical reunification of the empire under Constantinople's sole authority. Though he possessed neither the resources nor the inclination to exercise effective governance over the Western territories that had passed under barbarian control, the kingdoms that had emerged from the Western collapse continued their independent development, gradually evolving into the political entities that would shape medieval European history, while maintaining varying degrees of nominal acknowledgement of Eastern imperial supremacy. The Roman Empire persisted in the East for another millennium, its capital at Constantinople serving as a beacon of civilization and a repository of classical learning until the Ottoman conquest finally extinguished the Byzantine continuation of the Roman state in 1453. The fall of Rome represented the end of an unprecedented experiment in large-scale political organisation that had demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of ancient governance. The Roman state had achieved a degree of territorial integration and administrative sophistication that no previous political entity had approached, creating a common civilization across territories that extended from Scotland to Syria and from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. The peace and prosperity that Roman rule had provided during the empire's greatest centuries had enabled population growth, urban development, and cultural flourishing that would not be matched in Western Europe for 1,000 years. Yet the very scale of the Roman achievement had created vulnerabilities that eventually proved fatal, as the administrative and military requirements of maintaining such vast territories exceeded the resources that ancient technology and organization could sustainably provide. The fall of Rome thus illustrated the fundamental constraints within which all ancient empires operated, constraints that would not be overcome until the technological and organizational innovations of the modern era made possible political integration on even larger scales than Rome had achieved. The world that emerged from the ruins of the Roman Empire differed so fundamentally from the world that had preceded it that the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages represents one of the most significant transformations in human history. The political fragmentation, economic contraction, urban decline, and cultural reorientation that characterized the post-Roman centuries created conditions that required centuries of gradual development before European civilization would again approach the levels of complexity and prosperity that the Roman Empire had achieved. Yet the seeds of the medieval and modern worlds were planted in the soil of the Roman collapse as the synthesis of Roman, Germanic, and Christian elements that emerged from the 5th and 6th centuries provided the foundations upon which subsequent European development would build. The fall of Rome was not merely an ending but also a beginning, the painful transition through which one form of civilization gave way to another, and through which the ancient world became the medieval world that would eventually produce modernity itself. The eternal city that had ruled the Mediterranean world for half a millennium stood diminished but not destroyed in the years following the deposition of the last Western emperor, its monumental architecture slowly crumbling as the population that had once filled its streets dwindled to a fraction of its former numbers. The forum where orators had addressed the Roman people fell silent, its temples converted to churches or abandoned to decay. The Colosseum, where crowds had gathered to witness gladiatorial combat, stood empty, its massive structure quarried for building materials by generations of Romans for whom the monument represented not heritage but convenient stone. The aqueducts that had carried water to the city's fountains and baths ceased to function, as the maintenance they required exceeded the capacity of the diminished population to provide. The great roads that had connected Rome to the farthest reaches of its empire fell into disrepair, their paving stones overgrown and their bridges collapsed. Yet Rome endured, transformed from the capital of a universal empire into the seat of a universal church, its bishops claiming spiritual authority over the Christian world as their predecessors had claimed temporal authority over the Mediterranean. The papacy that emerged from the ruins of the Western Empire would shape medieval European civilization as profoundly as the emperors had shaped the ancient world, maintaining the continuity of Roman influence through institutional forms that outlasted the political structures within which they had originally developed. The story of Rome's fall encompasses not merely the political events that transferred power from Roman emperors to barbarian kings, but the entire transformation of ancient Mediterranean civilization into something fundamentally different. The world of Marcus Aurelius, with its integrated economy, flourishing cities, philosophical schools, and confident classical culture, had given way to the world of Gregory the Great, with its fragmented polities, contracted settlements, monastic learning, and Christian orientation toward eternal rather than earthly concerns. The transition had required centuries of gradual change punctuated by moments of catastrophe, and it had affected different regions at different times and in different ways. Yet by the end of the 6th century the transformation was essentially complete, and the medieval world had emerged from the chrysalis of antiquity. The Roman Empire that had created the conditions for this transformation, that had unified the Mediterranean world and established the frameworks within which classical civilization had flourished, had fulfilled its historical role and passed from the stage of the world history, leaving behind an inheritance that would shape human development for millennia to come, while demonstrating through its very dissolution the mortality that awaits all human institutions, however magnificent their achievements and however enduring their aspirations to permanence might be.